What would you do if you discovered that everything you'd built, every success you'd achieved, every dollar you'd earned was stolen from someone else? And what if that someone else was standing right in front of you, desperate to save their dying child? Tonight, you'll witness a collision 10 years in the making between Victoria Sterling, the ruthless CEO of a jewelry empire worth $500 million, and Tom Mitchell, the broken man whose stolen dreams built her fortune. By the end of this story, you'll understand that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't money power or revenge. It's a father's love and an 8-year-old girl's wisdom. If this story moves you, please hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and tell us in the comments, what would you sacrifice to save someone you love? When billionaire CEO meets the single father, she destroyed 10 years ago, everything changes. The emergency room at Boston Children's Hospital at 6:47 a.m. was a symphony of controlled chaos, machines beeping urgent rhythms, nurses moving with practiced efficiency, and the underlying current of barely contained fear that every parent in the pediatric ward understood without words. Tom Mitchell stood in the harsh fluorescent lighting, his construction worker's hands trembling, as he filled out forms that asked questions no father should have to answer about his 8-year-old daughter. Previous hospitalizations for diabetes-related complications. Average blood sugar episodes per month, 12 to 15. Current insurance coverage remote minimal. Each checkmark felt like another failure. Another reminder that despite 3 years of learning everything he could about type 1 diabetes, despite working double shifts to afford Sophie's medical supplies, despite sacrificing everything that had once defined him as a man, he still couldn't keep his daughter safe. Mr. Mitchell. The voice belonged to Dr. Elena Santos, the pediatric endocrinologist who had become far too familiar with their family's medical crises. At 43, she had the kind of direct, compassionate manner that came from delivering difficult news to desperate parents on a daily basis. Tom looked up from the clipboard, his weathered face showing every one of his 34 years, plus a decade more that loss had carved into his features. How is she, Doc? Sophie's stable now, but we need to have a serious conversation. Dr. Santos gestured toward a consultation room that Tom had sat in too many times before. The walls were painted in cheerful pastels that couldn't disguise the weight of the decisions made within them. As they walked, Tom caught glimpses through the observation windows of other families in crisis, a mother holding vigil beside her teenage son's bed, grandparents whispering prayers over a toddler connected to more machines than seemed possible, a father about Tom's age pacing while doctors worked behind a closed curtain. The pediatric ICU was a place where hope and heartbreak existed in such close proximity that you could feel both with every breath. Her blood sugar dropped to 34 during the night, Dr. Santos began once they were seated in the small consultation room. For reference, anything below 70 is considered dangerous. Below 40 can cause seizures, coma, or death. Tom's chest tightened with the familiar combination of terror and guilt that had become his constant companion since Sophie's diagnosis 3 years ago. But she's okay now. She's alive because you found her when you did. Tom, I need you to understand something. This is the third severe hypoglycemic episode in 2 months. The current insulin pump system is failing more frequently, and each failure puts Sophie at greater risk. Tom stared at his hands, scarred from years of construction work, permanently stained, despite scrubbing bearing calluses from the jewelry repair work he'd taken on to supplement his income. These hands had once created beauty from precious metals and stones, Amazones. Now they were just tools for survival, and apparently not very effective ones. What are our options? He asked, though his gut already knew the answer would involve numbers he couldn't afford. Doctor? Santos pulled out her tablet, showing him technical specifications that looked like a foreign language designed to exclude people like him. The latest continuous glucose monitoring system with predictive low alerts. It would prevent episodes like this morning by alerting you hours before Sophie's blood sugar drops to dangerous levels. How much? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Dr. Santos had had this conversation with hundreds of families, knew the weight that 2 simple words carried for parents whose love was measured against their financial limitations. The complete system is $24,000. Insurance will cover approximately 60%, leaving you with roughly $9,500 out of pocket for the initial setup. Then there are monthly supplies, sensor replacements, ongoing monitoring fees. $9,500. Tom made $3,200 a month when construction work was steady, which it hadn't been lately due to the Boston winter slowing outdoor projects. After rent, utilities, food, Sophie's current medical supplies, and the slowly diminishing debt from her previous hospitalizations, he had maybe $200 left each month. At that rate, it would take him 4 years to save enough if nothing else went wrong. If Sophie didn't have any more emergency room visits, if his health held out, if construction work remained available. How long can she stay on the current system? Tom asked quietly. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend more than a few weeks. Each malfunction increases the risk exponentially. The pump she's using now is 3 years old, well past its reliable lifespan. 3 weeks. Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. In 3 weeks, Sophie would be back in this hospital, possibly in worse condition. In 3 weeks, he would be sitting in the same chair having the same conversation, making the same impossible choices. There might be financial assistance programs, Dr. Santos continued gently. Some of the medical device companies offer payment plans for qualifying families. I can have our social worker. I've already applied to everything, Tom interrupted. Been on waiting lists for 18 months. Our income is just high enough to disqualify us for most aid programs, but nowhere near enough to actually afford what she needs. It was the cruel mathematics of being working poor in America's healthcare system, too much income for charity, too little for security. Tom made enough money to keep them housed and fed, but not enough to keep his daughter healthy. Tom, Dr. Santos said softly, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to know that Sophie is one of the bravest kids I've ever treated. Her understanding of her condition, her compliance with testing and medication, her attitude during procedures, she's remarkable. She gets that from her mother, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Santos had seen Sarah's name on Sophie's medical records, noted the dates that told their own story. Wife died when daughter was 5, single father managing complex medical condition alone. She'd watched Tom navigate the healthcare system with the desperate determination of someone for whom failure wasn't an option. Sarah would be proud of both of you, Dr. Santos said, and Tom felt his throat close up with emotion he couldn't afford to indulge. Can I see her, Bushfire? Of course, she's been asking for you. Sophie's hospital room was painted in soft blues and decorated with cartoon characters that were supposed to make sick children feel better, but mostly reminded everyone that childhood and medical crisis shouldn't coexist. Sophie herself looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her auburn hair the same color Sarah's had been spread across white pillows like spilled autumn leaves. IVs snaked from her thin arms to machines that measured and monitored the delicate chemistry keeping his daughter alive. The continuous beeping of the heart monitor provided a mechanical reassurance that her small body was still fighting, still enduring, still hoping for a future that Tom wasn't sure he could provide. Daddy, Sophie's voice was soft but alert. Green eyes, her mother's eyes, tracking to his face with the kind of mature focus that 8-year-old children shouldn't need to possess. Hey, princess. Tom settled into the chair that had become too familiar beside her bed, taking her small hand carefully to avoid disturbing the IV line. How are you feeling? Tired, scared. Sophie's honesty always caught him off guard. Other children might lie about being fine, but Sophie faced her condition with courage that humbled him daily. The pump stopped when working again, didn't it? Tom felt his chest tighten. He tried to shield her from the technical details, the financial stress, the weight of decisions that would determine her quality of life. But Sophie was too observant, too intelligent to believe in fairy tales when medical bills arrived monthly and conversations with doctors happened in hushed tones. Yes, sweetheart, but Dr. Santos says they can fix you up with something even better. Sophie studied his face with the perception of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions for survival clues. She could see the worry he tried to hide, the exhaustion that came from carrying impossible weight alone, the fear that lived behind every smile he gave her. Something expensive? She asked quietly. The question hit Tom like a physical blow. His 8-year-old daughter shouldn't have to understand the relationship between money and medical care, shouldn't have to factor financial considerations into her own health needs, shouldn't have to carry the weight of knowing that her survival depended on resources they didn't have. We'll figure it out, he said, the promise feeling hollow even as he spoke it. Daddy, Sophie said suddenly, her voice gaining the strength that always appeared when she'd made a decision. I have an idea. What's that, princess? Remember Mama's ring, the one you keep in the special box? Tom's entire world seemed to shift. Sarah's engagement ring, the last piece of jewelry he'd created before everything fell apart. The ring that represented not just his love for Sarah, but the dreams they'd shared, the future they'd planned, the man he'd been before loss and betrayal redefined him. He'd designed and crafted that ring during their courtship, spending months perfecting every detail to capture Sarah's gentle spirit and fierce determination. The center stone was a modest but perfectly cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones arranged in a pattern that represented the constellation visible on the night they'd first met. The band incorporated traditional Celtic knots, Sarah's heritage, with modern tension settings that had been revolutionary at the time. Sophie, that ring is special, I know. Sophie's grip on his hand tightened with surprising strength for someone so small. But Mama wouldn't want me to be sick when there's something that could help. She used to tell me that love isn't about keeping things, it's about letting them go when someone needs them more. The wisdom in his 8-year-old daughter's words hit Tom with devastating accuracy. Sarah had indeed said something similar during her final weeks, when cancer had been stealing her piece by piece, and she'd spent their last conversations teaching Sophie about love, sacrifice, and the difference between holding on and letting go. She told me that the most beautiful things aren't made of diamonds and gold. Sophie continued, her voice carrying an echo of Sarah's gentle philosophy. They're made of memories and love and the good things we do for each other. Tom felt tears threatening for the first time since Sophie's diagnosis, not from sadness, but from pride in this extraordinary child who understood concepts that many adults struggled with. Sarah's death had been devastating, but it had also revealed the strength and wisdom she'd passed on to their daughter. "Let me think about it, okay?" Tom said finally. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Okay, but Daddy, I think Mama would understand, and I think she'd want me to have the robot friend that keeps me safe." After Sophie had fallen asleep, the peaceful, deep sleep that came after medical crises had been resolved, and small bodies could finally rest, Tom found himself in the hospital parking garage at 2 a.m., sitting in his 15-year-old pickup truck and staring at a velvet box he hadn't opened in 3 years. Sarah's engagement ring caught the harsh fluorescent lighting and threw it back in fractured rainbows that reminded Tom of everything he'd lost and everything he was about to lose again. The ring represented the last tangible connection to the man he'd been before Marcus Holloway's betrayal had destroyed his career and his faith in the industry he'd loved since childhood. 10 years ago, Tom had been Thomas Mitchell, rising star in Boston's jewelry design community. His specialty was what he'd called evolutionary jewelry, engagement rings, and wedding sets that could be modified and updated as couples' relationships deepened and changed. Instead of replacing rings as families grew or circumstances changed, couples could add elements, modify settings, incorporate new stones that marked anniversaries, children's births, significant milestones. The concept had been revolutionary. Traditional jewelry was static, unchanging, often replaced rather than cherished. Tom's designs grew, with relationships becoming more beautiful and meaningful over time. He'd called the collection eternal bonds, pieces that evolved rather than remain frozen in the past. Marcus Holloway had been his mentor, business partner, and friend. A successful jewelry designer in his own right, Marcus had provided the business connections and industry relationships that Tom's innovative designs needed to reach market. Their partnership had seemed perfect. Tom's creative vision combined with Marcus's business acumen and established reputation. Then one November morning, exactly like this one, Tom had arrived at their shared workshop to find it empty. Not just empty of Marcus, but empty of everything. Design sketches, prototypes, client lists, equipment, even the coffee maker they'd shared every morning for 2 years. Security deposit forfeited, lease terminated without notice, business accounts closed. Marcus Holloway had vanished overnight, taking with him every design Tom had created, every innovation he'd developed, every sketch and prototype that represented 3 years of intensive work. 6 months later, Sterling Luxury had launched the Eternal Bonds collection under Marcus's name, featuring designs that were unmistakably, undeniably Tom's work. Tom had tried to fight it. He'd hired lawyers he couldn't afford, provided documentation, proving his authorship, testified before patent review boards. But Marcus had connections, resources, and a legal team that made Tom's evidence disappear into technical challenges and procedural delays. The case had dragged on for 18 months, consuming what little savings Tom had and destroying his reputation in an industry where accusations of theft, even false ones, could end careers. In the end, the Patent Office had ruled that insufficient evidence existed to challenge Sterling Luxury's ownership of the designs. The jewelry industry had closed ranks around Marcus in the established Sterling brand, treating Tom's claims as the desperate lies of a failed designer trying to profit from others' success. The betrayal had cost Tom everything. Not just his designs, but his workshop, his client relationships, his position in the industry. Other jewelry companies wouldn't hire someone who'd been involved in intellectual property disputes. Clients canceled commissions, unwilling to risk association with controversy. Suppliers demanded cash payments instead of extending the credit terms that small businesses required. Within 2 years, Thomas Mitchell, the jewelry designer, had ceased to exist. In his place was Tom Mitchell, construction worker, learning to swing a hammer instead of wielding precision tools, building other people's dreams instead of creating his own. He'd met Sarah during that dark period working construction on the apartment building where she taught elementary school art classes. She'd seen something in him that he'd forgotten existed. Creativity, gentleness, the ability to find beauty in damaged things and make them whole again. Their courtship had been built on long conversations about art design and the difference between creating beauty and simply recognizing it. Sarah had encouraged him to return to jewelry design to fight for recognition of his work to rebuild what Marcus had stolen. But by then, Sophie had been born, and Tom's priorities had shifted from professional vindication to family security. Construction work provided steady income health insurance, the kind of reliable paycheck that fed babies and paid rent. He'd created Sarah's engagement ring during those early days of their relationship, pouring all his remaining artistic passion into a single piece that would represent everything they meant to each other. The ring incorporated every technique he'd mastered, every innovation he'd developed, every element that made his work distinctive. It was in many ways the culmination of his career as a jewelry designer and the last piece he'd ever create. Now sitting in a hospital parking garage at 2 a.m., Tom understood that even this last connection to his former life might need to be sacrificed to save his daughter's future. The ring was beautiful, technically sophisticated, and irreplaceable. But Sophie was right, Sarah wouldn't want it preserved at the cost of their daughter's health. The ring represented love, and love required action rather than preservation. Tom pulled out his phone and began researching estate jewelry dealers in Boston, looking for someone who would appreciate the ring's craftsmanship and pay accordingly. Sophie would have her new insulin pump system, and Thomas Mitchell's last creation would disappear into the same anonymity that had claimed everything else he'd ever made. At 9 a.m. the following morning, Tom stood outside Meridian Fine Jewelry on Newbury Street, Sarah's ring nestled in its velvet box in his jacket pocket. The autumn morning was crisp and bright, the kind of October day that made Boston feel like possibility rather than limitation. Meridian Fine Jewelry occupied a prestigious address among galleries and boutiques that catered to Boston's wealthy elite. The storefront was elegant without being ostentatious, large windows, displaying carefully curated pieces, warm lighting that made precious metals glow, and the kind of understated sophistication that whispered expensive rather than shouting it. Tom felt acutely aware of his work clothes, his calloused hands, the way he clearly didn't belong in spaces designed for people who considered jewelry an investment rather than a necessity. But Meridian specialized in estate pieces and had a reputation for fair appraisals regardless of client backgrounds. The interior was all cream-colored display cases and soft classical music designed to make precious objects appear even more desirable. Thick carpet muffled his work boots as he approached the main counter, where a perfectly groomed sales associate waited with professional politeness. "Good morning," the man said, his nameplate reading James Whitmore, Senior Associate. His suit probably cost more than Tom made in a month, and his expression carried the subtle evaluation that people in luxury retail applied to potential customers. "How may I assist you today?" "I'd like to get an appraisal," Tom said, producing the ring box. "Possibly sell, depending on the offer." James accepted the box with practiced efficiency, but Tom caught the slight shift in his demeanor, the professional courtesy that remained but cooled noticeably as he took in Tom's appearance. In places like Meridian, assumptions were made quickly about who belonged and who was simply wasting everyone's time. "I see," James said, opening the box with the kind of careful attention that it suggested He'd seen plenty of worthless pieces brought in by desperate people with unrealistic expectations. We do handle estate pieces, though our clientele typically— James stopped mid-sentence. His expression changed from polite disinterest to genuine surprise as he lifted Sarah's ring into the light. "Oh," he said softly, and that single syllable carried more weight than the previous conversation. The ring caught the warm display lighting and transformed it into something magical. The center diamond threw rainbow patterns across the cream-colored walls, but it was the setting that truly captured attention. The design was unlike anything in Meridian's current inventory, technically innovative, while remaining classically beautiful modern, without sacrificing timeless elegance. Tom watched James examine the ring with growing attention, noting details that marked exceptional craftsmanship. The way the smaller stones were set to enhance rather than compete with the center diamond. The band's flowing lines that managed to incorporate complex metalwork without appearing busy. The overall design that felt both vintage and contemporary, as if it existed outside of fashion trends. "This is quite unusual," James said slowly, his tone completely different from his initial greeting. "The workmanship is exceptional. Do you have provenance documentation?" "It was custom made for my wife," Tom said, keeping his voice steady despite the emotional weight of those words. "I have the original design sketches and creation notes if needed." "You said it was custom made for your wife," James repeated carefully. "May I ask who the designer was?" Tom felt something shift in the conversation, a subtle tension that he couldn't quite identify. "I designed and made it myself." James set the ring down carefully, his expression now showing something that looked almost like recognition. "Mr. Mitchell. Tom Mitchell." The name hung in the air between them, and Tom saw James's eyes widen slightly. It was a reaction Tom hadn't seen in years, someone in the jewelry industry recognizing his name for reasons other than the legal controversy that had ended his career. "I'll need to consult with our master appraiser," James said, his professional mask now completely in place. "This piece requires specialized evaluation. Would you mind waiting? It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes." Tom nodded, settling into one of the leather chairs positioned around the showroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he watched Boston's morning foot traffic people, heading to offices, meeting friends for coffee, living lives that didn't require choosing between precious memories and children's medical care. 20 minutes stretched to 30, then 40. Other customers came and went, well-dressed women selecting tennis bracelets, an elderly couple upgrading anniversary gifts, a young man nervously purchasing an engagement ring. Each transaction moved smoothly, efficiently, with the kind of attention Tom wasn't receiving. He was beginning to wonder if James had forgotten about him when movement near the front entrance caught his attention. The glass doors opened to admit a woman whose presence seemed to shift the entire atmosphere of the showroom. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and wearing a charcoal wool coat that whispered expensive simplicity rather than shouting it. But what commanded attention wasn't her appearance so much as her bearing, the way staff members straightened unconsciously, the way conversations quieted as she passed, the way everyone in the store seemed suddenly more aware of their posture. "Ms. Sterling," James materialized beside her with the eager attention of someone whose commission depended on important clients. "We weren't expecting you today." Sterling, the name hit Tom like cold water, as in Sterling Luxury, the company that had built an empire on his stolen designs, as in the business that had profited from 10 years of his uncredited work. Tom watched this exchange with growing unease, noting how the woman, presumably Victoria Sterling, though he'd never seen her in person, moved through the space with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to deference. Sterling Luxury's CEO was known for being reclusive, rarely making public appearances, conducting business through carefully controlled channels that maintained her company's exclusive image. "Impromptu visit," Victoria replied, her voice carrying just enough accent to suggest interesting origins, carefully refined by expensive education. "I wanted to check on the estate acquisition we discussed last week." James was about to respond when Margaret Chen, the master appraiser Tom had been waiting to see, appeared from the back office carrying Sarah's ring on a velvet tray. "Ms. Sterling," Margaret said, her voice carrying professional excitement, "you'll want to see this piece. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, reminiscent of some of the finest work from the early 2000s. Victoria's gaze fell upon Sarah's ring, and the effect was immediate and unmistakable. Her composed expression cracked color draining from her face as she stared at the ring with something that looked like recognition or shock. Tom felt his stomach drop as understanding began to crystallize. This wasn't coincidence. Victoria Sterling was here. Sarah's ring was on display, and the woman whose company had destroyed his career was staring at his work with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what she was looking at. "Where did you acquire this piece?" Victoria's question came out sharper than intended, drawing surprised looks from both Margaret and James. "I'm sorry." Tom stood slowly, confusion mixing with a growing sense of alarm. Victoria stepped closer, her dark eyes fixed on the ring with an intensity that made Tom instinctively protective. That setting technique, the flowing integration of the band with the stone mounting. "Where did you acquire this piece?" "I made it," Tom said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "For my wife." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She actually swayed slightly, one hand reaching out to steady herself against the display case. Margaret and James exchanged confused glances, clearly sensing tension they didn't understand. "You made it," Victoria repeated, her voice strained. "10 years ago, it's my design, my work." Victoria's breathing had become shallow, her professional composure completely shattered. When she looked up from the ring to meet Tom's eyes, he saw something that made his chest tight with recognition guilt. Deep, consuming guilt that had been festering for years. "What's your name?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. "Tom Mitchell, Thomas Mitchell." The name hung in the air like a confession. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, Tom saw the confirmation of everything he'd suspected and feared. "Thomas Mitchell," she repeated softly, the full name carrying weight that had nothing to do with introduction. "The designer of eternal bonds." The jewelry store around them seemed to fade into background noise. Margaret's confused questions, James's attempts at professional mediation, the soft classical music, all of it became irrelevant beside this moment of recognition that had been 10 years in the making. Tom stared at this woman who embodied everything his stolen dreams had become. Victoria Sterling, who had built a luxury empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who had turned his Eternal Bonds collection into the most sought-after bridal jewelry in New England, who had achieved everything he'd once dreamed of achieving using work that bore his creative DNA, but not his name. "You knew," he said, the accusation quiet but unmistakable. Victoria's response came quickly, desperately. "Not at first. Marcus never told me where the designs came from. He said they were his work, his innovation. I believed him for too long." "When did you find out?" Victoria's hands twisted together with nervous energy, completely at odds with her usual composed public image. "3 years ago, after Marcus died, I found his private file sketches with your signature development notes in your handwriting correspondence about covering up the theft." Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. Marcus Holloway was dead, had been dead for 3 years, and Victoria Sterling had known the truth about the stolen designs that entire time. "So you knew and kept building anyway," he said, his voice flat with the weight of understanding. "I tried to find you," Victoria said desperately. "I hired investigators, searched public records, reached out to industry contacts. But Tom Mitchell had disappeared from jewelry completely. I couldn't locate the person whose work I was profiting from. Because Tom Mitchell was working construction and learning to repair other people's broken jewelry instead of creating his own," Tom replied bitterly. "Because Marcus Holloway's theft didn't just steal my designs, it destroyed my reputation, my connections, my faith in everything I'd worked toward." The pain in Tom's voice seemed to cut through Victoria like a blade. She swayed again, and this time Tom found himself reaching out instinctively to steady her before remembering who she was and pulling back. "I'm sorry," Victoria whispered. "I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I've regretted it every single day since I learned the truth." Margaret Shen, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion and concern, finally interjected, "Sterling, perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." Victoria nodded absently, then seemed to focus on their surroundings for the first time since recognizing the ring. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell, would you be willing to come to my office? We need to discuss compensation, proper attribution, making this right somehow." Tom stared at her, his mind reeling with implications. This woman, this stranger who had profited from his stolen work for a decade, was offering exactly what he dreamed of for 10 years. Recognition, compensation, the chance to reclaim his place in the industry he'd loved and lost. But even as she spoke, Tom's phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. Sophie asking for you. Pump malfunction this morning. Please call when convenient. Dr. Santos Sophie. His daughter was in a hospital bed dependent on failing medical equipment, needing an insulin pump system that cost more than he could earn in 6 months. And Victoria Sterling represented resources that could save his daughter's life within hours instead of months. How did you separate justice from necessity? How did you weigh 10 years of betrayal against your child's immediate survival? Mr. Mitchell. Victoria's voice was gentle, almost tentative. I understand this is overwhelming, but please let me try to make amends for what Marcus did, what I unknowingly participated in. Tom looked down at Sarah's ring still resting on Margaret's velvet tray. The symbol of love and loss, the last tangible connection to dreams that had died with his wife and career. Then he thought of Sophie's mature wisdom, her quiet courage in the face of medical uncertainty. My daughter's in the hospital, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. She needs medical equipment we can't afford. If you really want to make amends. Victoria's response was immediate without hesitation. Whatever she needs, whatever the cost. You don't even know what we're talking about. It doesn't matter. Victoria's voice carried absolute conviction. If you'll let me help, if you'll give me the chance to begin making this right, then whatever your daughter needs is already taken care of. Tom felt tears threatening for the first time since Sophie's diagnosis. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of a father who'd been carrying impossible weight is finally feeling it begin to lift. Why, he asked quietly. After all this time, why do you care what happens to us? Victoria met his gaze directly, and Tom saw in her dark eyes the same vulnerability he'd glimpsed in the hospital. Someone carrying guilt too heavy for one person to bear alone. Because, she said softly, I've spent 10 years trying to honor work I had no right to claim. Because your designs taught me what real innovation looks like. Because I've built everything I have on a foundation that wasn't mine to build on. She paused, gathering courage for something more personal. And because seeing that ring, seeing work that was created with such love and skill reminded me that behind every stolen dream is a real person whose life was changed forever. Margaret cleared her throat delicately. Should I prepare the ring for transport? Tom looked at the piece that represented everything he'd lost and found everything he was prepared to sacrifice for Sophie's future. Then he looked at Victoria Sterling, whose empire had been built on his stolen foundations, but who seemed genuinely committed to making amends. Actually, he said slowly, I think I'll keep it for now. Victoria's smile was soft with relief. I'm glad. It belongs with you. As they prepared to leave Meridian together, Tom pocketing Sarah's ring, Victoria making calls to arrange Sophie's immediate medical care, neither of them spoke about the weight of what had just been revealed. The afternoon sunlight caught Victoria's hair as she held the door, and Tom noticed for the first time that beneath her professional armor was someone who seemed almost as lost as he'd been. Your daughter, Victoria said as they reached the sidewalk outside. What's her name? Sophie Mitchell. Sophie Mitchell, Victoria repeated as if committing the name to memory. I'd like to meet her if that would be all right with you. Tom studied Victoria's face, looking for signs of performative charity or guilty obligation. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like hope, as if meeting Sophie might offer a chance at redemption that went beyond financial compensation. She'll like you, Tom said finally. She has good instincts about people, even people who've made terrible mistakes. Especially then, Tom replied, thinking of Sophie's wisdom about forgiveness and second chances. That's when you really find out what someone's made of. As they walked toward Tom's pickup truck, neither of them noticed the figure watching from across the street, a well-dressed man with silver hair, whose expression suggested their unlikely partnership was about to face challenges neither had anticipated. The afternoon shadows were growing longer, and somewhere in a hospital room, an 8-year-old girl was waiting for her father to return with news about her future. Neither Tom nor Victoria realized it yet, but that future would depend not just on medical equipment or financial resources, but on their ability to transform 10 years of betrayal into something resembling trust. The collision had happened. Now came the much harder work of building something beautiful from the wreckage. Boston Children's Hospital felt different when you arrived with hope instead of desperation. Tom walked through the familiar corridors beside Victoria, whose presence seemed to transform not just the quality of attention they received, but something fundamental about their circumstances. Nurses who had been professionally kind were now actively welcoming. The financial counselor, who had previously discussed payment plans with apologetic sympathy, now spoke of immediate approvals and expedited processing. The new continuous glucose monitoring system will be delivered within the hour, Victoria was explaining as they approached Sophie's room. Dr. Santos has already reviewed the specifications. It's the most advanced pediatric system available. Tom nodded, still struggling to process the speed with which his daughter's medical crisis had been resolved. 6 hours ago, he'd been contemplating selling his last connection to Sarah. Now Sophie's treatment was secured, her future no longer hanging in the balance of his financial limitations. But as they paused outside Sophie's door, Tom felt compelled to establish boundaries that would protect his daughter from adult complications that she shouldn't have to navigate. "Miss Sterling," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something before we go in there." Victoria turned to him with the direct attention that was becoming familiar. No performative politeness, just genuine focus. "Of course. Sophie doesn't know anything about the history between us. The stolen designs, Marcus Holloway, any of it. To her, you're just the woman who's helping with her medical care." "I understand," Victoria replied. "What would you like me to tell her about why I'm helping?" Tom considered this carefully. Sophie's emotional intelligence was formidable, and she'd certainly ask pointed questions about Victoria's motivations. But she was also 8 years old, dealing with enough medical complexity without adding adult guilt and betrayal to her emotional load. "Tell her you're someone who believes in helping families when they need it," Tom said finally. "That's true enough." Victoria's smile was soft with something that might have been relief. "It is true, just not the whole truth. The whole truth is complicated. Sophie understands that sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings about things they can't fully explain yet." Smart girl. Too smart sometimes. She sees things that adults try to hide, understands connections that we think we're keeping secret. Tom's voice carried both pride and concern. 3 years of managing a chronic illness has taught her to read people's situations undercurrent as that other kids her age wouldn't notice. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "I'll follow your lead. And Tom, thank you for trusting me with this." Sophie was sitting up in bed when they entered, her color significantly improved from the morning's crisis. She'd been drawing in a sketchbook Tom had brought from home, and her face lit up when she saw him. "Daddy," she set the sketchbook aside, reaching for him with the uncomplicated joy that made every difficult moment worthwhile. "Dr. Santos said you found a way to get the new pump." "I had some help," Tom said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Sophie, I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Ms. Sterling." Victoria approached the bed with careful grace, clearly uncertain about how to interact with a hospitalized child. She'd built a career commanding boardrooms and negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, but an 8-year-old's direct attention felt more challenging than any business confrontation. "Hello, Sophie," Victoria said softly. "Your father has told me wonderful things about you." Sophie studied Victoria with the same direct assessment she applied to all new adults in her life. The careful evaluation of someone who'd learned that adults often had agendas hidden behind their kindness. "Are you the one helping with my medical stuff?" Sophie asked. "I am. I hope that's all right with you." "It's very all right," Sophie said solemnly. "Thank you for caring about people you don't even know yet." The simple gratitude in Sophie's voice hit Victoria like a physical blow. She'd expected questions about motivations, perhaps childish wariness of strangers bearing gifts. Instead, she was receiving grace from someone who understood that kindness didn't require explanation. "You're very welcome." Victoria managed her professional composure, cracking just enough to reveal the vulnerability underneath. "What are you drawing?" Victoria asked, noticing the sketchbook that Sophie had set aside. Sophie brightened, holding up detailed pencil drawings of jewelry designs. "Daddy taught me how to draw rings and necklaces. See, this one has secret compartments where you could hide tiny love notes for the person you're married to." Victoria's breath caught audibly. The drawing was remarkably sophisticated for an 8-year-old, technically proficient, but also innovative in the way it combined traditional elements with whimsical touches that spoke to a child's imagination. More importantly, the design philosophy was unmistakably familiar. "That's beautiful work," Victoria said, her voice slightly strained. "You have real talent. Daddy says I get it from both sides. Mama was an artist too before she got sick." Sophie's matter-of-fact reference to her mother's death demonstrated the emotional maturity that consistently amazed Tom. She painted watercolors of gardens and flowers. Daddy kept all her paintings, and sometimes we look at them together, and he tells me stories about her. Victoria glanced at Tom, who was watching the interaction with careful attention. The parallels were impossible to ignore Sophie's artistic heritage, her natural understanding of design principles, the way she approached creativity as both technical skill and emotional expression. "Your father is a very skilled teacher," Victoria observed. "The best," Sophie agreed. "He knows everything about making beautiful things. He used to have his own collection and everything, but then some mean person stole his designs." The room went very quiet. Victoria had gone completely still, her face carefully neutral in a way that suggested intense emotional effort. Tom felt his chest tighten with the knowledge that his daughter had just innocently revealed the central tragedy of his professional life to the person most responsible for its continuation. "That must have been very difficult," Victoria said quietly, her voice controlled with visible effort. "It was, but Daddy says sometimes bad things happen, so good things can happen later." Sophie's wisdom was delivered with the absolute conviction of childhood innocence. "Like how Mama getting sick was terrible, but it meant Daddy learned how to take care of me really, really well. And how me having diabetes is scary, but it means we meet good doctors and kind people who help us." Victoria's eyes glistened with unshed tears. This 8-year-old was offering her a framework for understanding suffering that most adults struggled to achieve, the possibility that pain could be transformed into purpose, that loss could create space for unexpected grace. "That's a very wise way to look at things," Victoria said softly. "Mama used to say that every ending is just a beginning. They're wearing a disguise." Sophie settled back against her pillows, clearly pleased to share her mother's philosophy. "Do you think that's true?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. This wasn't casual conversation with a child. This was Sophie unconsciously asking whether redemption was possible, whether the ending of Victoria's old life could become the beginning of something better. "I think," Victoria said finally, "that some of the best things in my life have come from situations that seemed terrible when they were happening." "Like what?" Victoria glanced at Tom, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "Like learning that something I thought belonged to me actually belonged to someone else. That felt awful when I found out, but it also meant I could try to make things right." Sophie absorbed this with thoughtful attention, her young mind processing adult complexity with remarkable sophistication. "You mean like when I accidentally took Emma's colored pencils from school? I felt really bad, but returning them meant Emma and I became better friends because she knew she could trust me." "Exactly like that," Victoria said, her smile genuine for the first time since entering the room. "Sometimes making mistakes teaches us how to be better people." Oliver Santos appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, and an expression of professional satisfaction. "Sorry to interrupt, but I have excellent news about the new monitoring system." "How are we looking?" Tom asked. "Better than excellent. The continuous glucose monitor arrived 20 minutes ago, and it's even more advanced than we discussed." Dr. Santos moved to Sophie's bedside with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she was genuinely excited about the technology. "This system doesn't just monitor blood sugar, it predicts dangerous trends hours before they become critical. It will alert both Sophie and your smartphone if her levels are moving toward hypoglycemia." "It talks to Daddy's phone?" Sophie asked with 8-year-old fascination. "It does, and it learns your patterns over time, so the predictions become more accurate the longer you wear it." Dr. Santos showed them the small device that would become integral to Sophie's daily life. "We can start the installation process in about an hour, and if everything goes smoothly, you should be able to go home tomorrow morning." "Home by tomorrow?" Sophie asked hopefully. "If you follow all the instructions and let us make sure everything's working properly." Dr. Santos confirmed. I will, I promise. Sophie turned to Victoria with sudden inspiration. Miss Sterling, would you like to come have dinner with us when I get him out? Daddy makes really good pasta, and I could show you more of my drawings. Victoria's expression cycled through surprise, uncertainty, and something that looked like longing. The invitation was simple, innocent, but it carried implications that went far beyond sharing a meal. Sophie was asking Victoria to become part of their family dynamic, to move from stranger helping with medical crisis to person worthy of inclusion in their most intimate space. That's very kind, Sophie, but I wouldn't want to impose on family time, Victoria said carefully. You wouldn't be imposing, Tom said quietly, realizing as he spoke that he meant it. Sophie's right, I do make good pasta, and it might be nice to continue our conversation from earlier in a more relaxed setting. Victoria met his gaze, clearly understanding that continuing the conversation meant addressing 10 years of stolen work-built empires and the complex mathematics of attempting to make amends for corporate theft and personal betrayal. I'd like that very much, she said finally. Yay! Sophie clapped her hands together with delight. This is turning out to be a very good day, even though it started scary. But while Sophie celebrated and Victoria made arrangements for her company to handle the medical equipment installation, neither of them noticed the text message that had arrived on Victoria's phone 20 minutes earlier. David Sterling had immediate meeting, raw, agree unauthorized expenditures. My office, 6 p.m. today. This cannot wait. Victoria's stepfather had discovered her intervention in Sophie's medical care, and his message carried the kind of controlled anger that Victoria had learned to fear during her teenage years. David Sterling didn't make requests, he issued summons, and ignoring them came with consequences that could reshape her entire future. The reckoning she'd been avoiding for 3 years was finally at hand. Later that evening, David Sterling's office occupied the top floor of a Back Bay brownstone that had been in his family for 3 generations, its windows offering commanding views of Boston Common and the financial district beyond. The space was designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Dark mahogany, leather-bound legal volumes, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who had built their wealth through methods that wouldn't bear close scrutiny in modern light. Victoria stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching evening commuters hurry past on Commonwealth Avenue, while David reviewed the medical assistant's paperwork she'd been dreading to provide. The silence stretched long enough to be deliberately uncomfortable, a negotiating technique David had perfected during 40 years of corporate law practice. $24,000, David said finally, his voice carrying in the controlled displeasure that had shaped Victoria's adult relationship with authority. For a stranger's medical bills, without board approval, without committee review, without any discussion of precedent or policy implications. It was an emergency situation, Victoria replied, keeping her voice level despite the familiar anxiety that David's disapproval triggered. The child needed immediate medical intervention. The child, David repeated, flipping through the documents with methodical attention designed to maximize her discomfort. Sophie Mitchell, 8 years old, diabetic, daughter of Thomas Mitchell of Jamaica Plain. David's precision in reciting these details suggested investigation that went far beyond the paperwork Victoria had provided. She felt ice settle in her stomach as she realized her stepfather had been researching the Mitchell family's background. Any relation, David continued with the measured cadence of cross-examination, to the Thomas Mitchell who filed intellectual property claims against Marcus Holloway 10 years ago. Victoria had prepared for this moment during the drive from the hospital, but the reality of it felt more treacherous than anticipated. David's memory for legal complications that might threaten the company was legendary among Sterling Luxury's staff. You remember that lawsuit? She asked carefully. I remember everything that threatened Sterling's interests, David replied, his pale eyes narrowing with the focus that had made him one of Boston's most feared corporate attorneys. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence, but it generated enough negative publicity to require careful reputation management. The dismissal hadn't been for lack of evidence, Victoria knew. It had been the result of superior legal resources deployed against a desperate man who couldn't afford prolonged litigation. Marcus had buried Tom's legitimate claims under procedural challenges and technical objections that exhausted his resources and resolve. Is this the same Thomas Mitchell? David asked with the directness of someone who already knew the answer. Victoria had reached the moment of truth, the choice between the comfortable lie that had sustained her career and the dangerous honesty that might destroy it. Yes, she said simply. The single word hung in the air like a confession. David set the paperwork down with deliberate precision, his expression cycling through calculation and growing anger. You paid $24,000 in medical bills for the man who tried to destroy Marcus's reputation, the man who claimed our most successful collection was built on stolen designs. The man whose designs were stolen, Victoria corrected quietly, her voice growing stronger with each word. The man whose 10 years of unpaid royalties built this office, funded your retirement accounts, and made Sterling Luxury the company it is today. David's face went very still in the way that had always preceded his most devastating legal arguments. Excuse me. Victoria moved away from the window, settling into the chair across from David's desk, with the kind of composed determination she'd learned from watching him navigate hostile business negotiations. The irony wasn't lost on her, using his own techniques to confront him with truths he'd helped conceal. I found Marcus's private files after he died. Complete documentation proving that Thomas Mitchell's accusations were accurate. The Eternal Bonds collection was stolen intellectual property. That's impossible, David said flatly. Marcus created those designs. Marcus stole those designs. Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. I have sketches in Mitchell's handwriting, patent applications with forged signatures, correspondence between Marcus and his lawyers about covering up the theft. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. David's expression shifted from anger to something more calculating and infinitely more dangerous. In corporate law, he'd built his reputation on finding ways to make inconvenient truths disappear into technical complexities and legal technicalities. Where are these alleged documents? He asked with the careful neutrality of someone gathering intelligence. In multiple secure locations, with copies held by parties who have instructions to release them if anything happens to me or the Mitchell family. It was a bluff, but a necessary one. Victoria had learned enough about corporate warfare from David himself to understand the importance of protective measures. Victoria, David's voice now carried the patronizing tone that had always made her feel simultaneously protected and diminished. You are clearly being manipulated by a desperate man seeking to exploit your charitable instincts. This Mitchell person has convinced you. No one has convinced me of anything except my own conscience, Victoria interrupted sharply. I've seen the evidence, I know the truth, and I know what we owe Thomas Mitchell for 10 years of profiting from his stolen work. We owe him nothing, David said, with the flat certainty of someone who had spent decades making legal problems disappear. Sterling Luxury operates under established intellectual property protections. Even if these documents exist, which I seriously doubt, the statute of limitations on any potential claim expired years ago. Legal obligations and ethical obligations aren't the same thing. David's laugh was harsh and completely devoid of warmth. Ethics are luxuries for people who can afford them, Victoria. I taught you that when you were 12 years old and trying to give away your allowance to every sob story you encountered. The reference to her childhood hit Victoria like a slap, reminding her of countless lectures about the difference between sentiment and business sense, between emotional impulses and practical decisions. David had spent 20 years training her to prioritize self-interest over integrity, teaching her that moral purity was for people who didn't understand how competitive the real world actually was. You taught me to prioritize appearances over truth, Victoria replied. I'm no longer interested in that education. You're no longer interested in protecting the company that provides your lifestyle, the business that employs 300 people, the reputation that took decades to build. The argument was classic, David Sterling appealing to her sense of responsibility for others while ignoring the fundamental injustice that made those others' livelihoods possible. It was the same logic that had justified every morally questionable decision throughout Sterling Luxury's history. I'm interested in building something worthy of my mother's memory instead of something that would have disgusted her. Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of invoking Isabella. The reference to Victoria's mother was a deliberate provocation, and it hit David exactly as intended. He'd never spoken of Isabella except to criticize her impractical values and unrealistic, expectations about how the world actually worked. Your mother was a romantic who died poor and forgotten, David said coldly, his mask of paternal concern finally slipping completely. I saved you from following that path. You saved me from becoming a person she would have recognized as her daughter, Victoria replied, but it's not too late to honor what she believed in. David stood abruptly, moving to the window where Victoria had been standing. His silhouette against the Boston skyline was imposing in the way he'd carefully cultivated a man who commanded resources, influenced important decisions, and didn't accept defeat gracefully. What exactly are you proposing? He asked without turning around. Public confession of intellectual property theft, financial reparations that could bankrupt Sterling, luxury, destroying everything Marcus and I built because you've developed a guilty conscience. I'm proposing partnership with Thomas Mitchell, bringing him into Sterling Luxury, officially acknowledging his contributions to our success and building on his innovations rather than continuing to profit from his stolen work. Partnership, David repeated, incredulously, finally turning to face her. With the man who tried to sue us for intellectual property theft. You want to make him a partner in the company built on designs you claim were stolen from him. I want to make him a partner in the company that was always rightfully partly his, Victoria corrected. David's expression grew harder than she'd ever seen it, the genial stepfather mask completely abandoned in favor of the corporate attorney who had built his career on making difficult problems disappear. You seem to have forgotten something important, Victoria. Sterling Luxury isn't yours to give away. I control 49% of the company through various trust structures and corporate partnerships. Any major decision requires board approval, and I have enough influence to block anything I consider detrimental to our interests. The threat was explicit, now no longer disguised as paternal guidance. Victoria felt a chill of recognition. This was the David Sterling that opponents in corporate litigation had learned to fear, the man who could weaponize legal structures to destroy anyone who threatened his interests. And you consider honesty detrimental to our interests? Victoria asked. I consider public admission of intellectual property theft catastrophically detrimental to our interests, David replied with brutal honesty. Such an admission would expose us to massive lawsuits, destroy our reputation with clients and suppliers, and potentially trigger federal investigations into other aspects of our business practices. Victoria felt cold understanding wash over her. The stolen designs weren't the only skeleton in Sterling Luxury's corporate closet. What other aspects, David? Nothing you need to concern yourself with, David said with a dismissive wave that carried years of condescension. But businesses that operate at our level inevitably encounter gray areas in tax law, labor regulations, import restrictions. We can't afford the scrutiny that would come with admitting Marcus's alleged theft. The conversation had shifted into territory Victoria hadn't anticipated, revealing layers of potential legal liability that went far beyond intellectual property disputes. She'd known David was ruthless in business, but she'd assumed his methods were legal, if not entirely ethical. What aren't you telling me? She asked quietly, her voice carrying new understanding of the stakes involved. David's smile was thin and completely humorless. I'm telling you that idealistic impulses have consequences beyond your personal conscience. If you insist on pursuing this ridiculous partnership with Mitchell, you'll destroy not just Sterling Luxury, but potentially expose yourself to criminal liability you don't understand. It was blackmail carefully disguised as paternal protection, the same combination of intimidation and obligation that had kept Victoria compliant for 20 years of corporate success built on increasingly questionable foundations. And if I don't pursue it, then you remain the successful businesswoman I raised you to be. Mitchell gets his medical bills paid, a generous gesture that reflects well on our charitable giving. The past stays buried where it belongs, and everyone continues to prosper. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Tom's patient rebuilding of his life after Marcus's betrayal, about Sophie's courage in facing medical uncertainty with grace and wisdom, about Isabella's belief that integrity mattered more than security. No, she said finally. No. No, I won't let the past stay buried. No, I won't prioritize Sterling's reputation over doing what's right. And no, I won't continue building my life on someone else's stolen foundation. David's face went through several color changes as he processed the reality that his carefully constructed system of control was being challenged by the person he'd raised to be its ultimate beneficiary. "Victoria, you're not thinking clearly," he said, his voice now carrying the tone he'd used when she was 12 and questioning his authority. "The stress of recent events, this Mitchell family's medical crisis, your emotional reaction to childhood memories, I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," Victoria interrupted, "and I'm done being afraid of consequences that matter less than doing the right thing." "You should be afraid of consequences," David said sharply, his paternal mask finally dissolving completely. "Because if you persist with this insane plan, you'll discover exactly how much power 49% ownership provides when it's wielded by someone who understands business reality." The threat was now completely explicit. David was prepared to destroy Sterling Luxury rather than allow acknowledgement of the theft that had made their success possible. It was the ultimate expression of the philosophy that had guided their relationship: control through fear compliance, through obligation, success through moral compromise. "Is that your final position?" Victoria asked. "It's my only position," David replied with absolute certainty. "Sterling Luxury will not admit to intellectual property theft, will not enter into partnership with Thomas Mitchell, and will not expose itself to the legal and reputational damage your guilt is demanding." Victoria nodded slowly, feeling something crystallize inside her. Not just determination, but something closer to liberation from expectations that had never truly been hers. "Then I suppose we have a fundamental disagreement about what Sterling Luxuries should become," she said quietly. "We have a fundamental disagreement about reality," David corrected. "But you'll see reason eventually. You always do." Victoria stood, gathering her composure like armor, for the battle she now understood was inevitable. "Actually, David, I think you're about to discover that the woman you raised is much less predictable than you assumed." She was halfway to the door when David's voice stopped her with words that carried the weight of 20 years of manipulation disguised as protection. "Victoria, if you force me to choose between protecting this company and protecting your feelings, you won't like the choice I make." Victoria turned back to face the man who had shaped her adult life in ways both beneficial and destructive, whose influence had given her opportunities while requiring her to abandon the values that might have made those opportunities meaningful. "And if you force me to choose between living honestly and living comfortably," she replied with quiet conviction, "you definitely won't like the choice I make." The door closed behind her with finality that felt like freedom and terrified her at the same time. As Victoria sat in her car outside David's office, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear, she realized that everything she'd built over 20 years was now in jeopardy. Her position as CEO, her financial security, her social standing, all of it could disappear if David followed through on his threats. But for the first time since Isabella's death, Victoria felt like she was honoring her mother's memory instead of betraying it. The scared 12-year-old, who had learned to prioritize acceptance over authenticity, was finally growing into the woman Isabella had raised her to become. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Sophie's new monitoring system is working perfectly. She wanted me to tell you that she's excited about dinner tomorrow and has been planning the menu. Thank you for giving us hope when we thought we were out of options." Victoria smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Whatever David threatened, whatever corporate warfare lay ahead, she'd already accomplished something that mattered more than quarterly profits or stock prices. She'd helped save a child's life and begun the process of making amends for 10 years of theft. The reckoning was just beginning, but maybe that was exactly what had been needed all along. Tomorrow she would tender her resignation from Sterling Luxury and begin the process of building something honest with Tom Mitchell. Tonight she would go home to her empty Beacon Hill townhouse and plan for a future that honored truth rather than hiding from it. The old Victoria Sterling was ending. Victoria Isabella Ramirez was finally ready to begin. The morning of Sophie's hospital discharge dawned with the kind of November brightness that made Boston feel like a city of possibilities rather than limitations. Victoria sat in her Beacon Hill townhouse at 6 a.m., surrounded by files that represented 20 years of professional success built on increasingly questionable foundations. Marcus Holloway's private documents were spread across her dining room table, like evidence in a trial that had never been held. Patent applications with forged signatures, correspondence about intellectual property theft, design sketches in handwriting that clearly wasn't Marcus's. The proof of Tom's claims was overwhelming, but so was the evidence of what had been built afterward. Sterling Luxury employed 247 people directly with another 400 contractors and suppliers whose livelihoods depended on their business. The Eternal Bonds collection alone generated $80 million annually, funding not just salaries and benefits, but also the charitable foundation Victoria had established in her mother's memory. How did you dismantle an empire without destroying the innocent lives that depended on it? Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. David Sterling has called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. All directors required to attend. He said it's regarding potential threats to company stability. Victoria set the phone aside without responding. She'd known this moment would come, the corporate equivalent of a nuclear option, where David would use his board influence to force her removal as CEO rather than allow acknowledgement of the company's fraudulent foundations. But first, she had a more important engagement. Today, Sophie Mitchell was coming home from the hospital with a medical device that would transform her quality of life, and Victoria had been invited to share in that celebration. Whatever corporate warfare awaited, it could wait until after she'd honored a promise to an 8-year-old girl who had shown her what genuine courage looked like. At Boston Children's Hospital, the discharge process was moving with unusual efficiency. Sophie's new continuous glucose monitor was functioning perfectly, providing real-time blood sugar readings to both her small device and Tom's smartphone. The technology that had been financially impossible just 48 hours ago was now seamlessly integrated into their daily routine. The system learned Sophie's patterns over time, Dos Santos was explaining as she completed the final paperwork. The predictive algorithms become more accurate with each day of data, eventually providing warnings hours before dangerous blood sugar drops occur. Tom nodded, still somewhat stunned by the speed with which Sophie's medical crisis had been resolved. The device that might have taken him years to afford was now providing security he'd only dreamed of, courtesy of a woman whose connection to his past remained surreal. And if there are any problems, Tom asked, 24-hour technical support, automatic data backup, immediate alerts to our medical team if the system detects any abnormalities, Dr. Santos replied. Sophie is now connected to one of the most advanced pediatric diabetes management networks in the country. Can I really go home now? Sophie asked from her hospital bed, where she'd been sketching in preparation for the art project she'd planned for Victoria's dinner visit. You can really go home, Dr. Santos confirmed. Your new robot friend is working perfectly. Sophie beamed with excitement, but then her expression grew more thoughtful. Dr. Santos is Miss Sterling here yet? I want to show her something before we leave. I'm here, sweetheart, Victoria said from the doorway, carrying the coffee and pastries she'd brought for what felt like a celebration rather than a hospital discharge. Sophie's face lit up with genuine joy. Ms. Sterling, I drew something special for you. Victoria approached the bed with careful attention, noting how much stronger and more vibrant Sophie looked and with stable blood sugar levels. The transformation was remarkable. This was the child Sophie was meant to be when medical technology worked as it should. I'm honored, Victoria said, settling into the chair beside Sophie's bed. What did you create? Sophie opened her sketchbook to reveal a detailed pencil drawing of two women standing together in what appeared to be a jewelry workshop. One woman was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a professional style, the other shorter with flowing hair and paint-stained hands. Between them, a small girl was working at a design table with various jewelry pieces spread around them like treasures waiting to be discovered. That's you and my mama, Sophie explained, pointing to the figures in the drawing. I imagined what it would look like if you could have met her, and if you could work together on beautiful things that help people remember love. Victoria's breath caught. The drawing was emotionally devastating in its innocence. This child had created an image of reconciliation that bridged lost guilt and possibility in a way that adult minds struggled to achieve. Sophie, this is... Victoria struggled for the words inadequate to the gift she was receiving. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever created for me. Really? And Sophie asked with 8-year-old pleasure at adult praise. Really? And you know what, I think your mama would have liked working on jewelry that helps people remember love. She would have, Sophie agreed with absolute certainty. She used to say that the most important job for grown-ups was making the world more beautiful for children. Daddy does that by fixing broken jewelry and making it whole again. And you do that by helping families like ours when we need it most. Tom watched this exchange with growing amazement at his daughter's ability to distill complex adult emotions into simple truths that cut through years of guilt and complicated motivations. Your daddy is very good at making broken things beautiful again. Victoria agreed, her voice soft with emotion. Maybe you could learn from him, Sophie suggested, with the direct problem-solving approach that had served her well in managing her medical condition. And maybe he could learn business things from you. That way you could both help more people. Victoria met Tom's eyes across Sophie's hospital bed, both of them recognizing the profound wisdom in this child's unconscious suggestion. Partnership, collaboration, using their complementary skills to create something neither could achieve alone. That's an interesting idea, Victoria said carefully. What do you think, Tom? Tom considered the question, while Dr. Santos completed the final discharge documentation. Partnership with Victoria Sterling meant associating with the woman whose company had profited from his stolen designs, but it also meant working with someone who seemed genuinely committed to making amends and building something better. I think, Tom said slowly, that Sophie might be onto something important. Sophie clapped her hands with delight. Can we talk about it more at dinner tonight? I've planned the whole menu, and I want to hear all your ideas about beautiful things that help people. Definitely, Victoria agreed. I can't wait to taste your cooking and see more of your artwork. As they gathered Sophie's belongings and prepared to leave the hospital, Victoria felt her phone buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from Sterling Luxury's board members. David was clearly escalating his campaign to force a confrontation, but Victoria found that the prospect no longer carried the terror it might have just days ago. Ms. Sterling, Sophie asked as they waited for Tom to bring the car around. Are you worried about something? You keep looking at your phone with the same expression Daddy gets when bills arrive. Victoria smiled at Sophie's perceptive observation. I am worried about some work things. Sometimes adults have to make very difficult decisions about what's most important. Like what? Victoria considered how to explain corporate politics to an 8-year-old without burdening her with adult complications she shouldn't have to understand. Like whether it's more important to keep a job that pays well but makes you feel bad about yourself, or to do work that makes you feel proud even if it's more difficult. Sophie absorbed this with thoughtful attention. That's easy. You should do work that makes you feel proud. Money can't buy the feeling you get when you know you're helping people. Even if doing the right thing means giving up things that feel safe and comfortable. Especially then, Sophie said with the 8-year-old certainty. Mama used to tell me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. Victoria felt tears threatening at the simple wisdom flowing from this remarkable child. Sophie had just articulated the choice Victoria had been struggling with for 3 years: security versus integrity, comfort versus conscience. Your mama was a very wise woman, Victoria said softly. She was. And she taught me that the best grown-ups are the ones who keep learning how to be better people even when it's hard. Tom returned with the partner, and as they helped Sophie into the back seat with her discharge paperwork and new medical equipment, Victoria made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to her assistant. Please inform David Sterling that I will not be attending this afternoon's board meeting. I am resigning my position as CEO of Sterling Luxury effective immediately. I'll send formal documentation within the hour. As she hit send, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years, the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of choosing authenticity over security. Everything okay? Tom asked, noting her expression as they drove through Boston traffic toward Jamaica Plain. Actually, Victoria said, watching Sophie sketch contentedly in the back seat, I think everything is about to be very okay for the first time in a long time. That evening, Jamaica Plain. Tom's modest house in Jamaica Plain felt worlds away from the corporate battlefields that had defined Victoria's adult life. The 2-bedroom ranch was carefully maintained despite its age, with small touches that spoke of love and attention, window boxes with fall flowers, a front porch swing that Sarah had picked out photographs throughout the house that captured the beautiful ordinariness of family life. The kitchen was the heart of the home, clearly designed by people who valued cooking as family time rather than mere nutrition. Sophie had taken charge of dinner preparation with the enthusiasm of a child who'd been planning this meal for days. Daddy taught me how to make his special pasta sauce, Sophie explained as she stirred a pot that seemed almost too large for her small hands. The secret is that you have to cook it really slowly and taste it lots of times to make sure the flavors are talking to each other properly. Victoria watched Sophie work with the same focused attention she brought to her artwork, treating cooking as another form of creativity that deserved respect and patience. Your cooking technique is very impressive, Victoria observed. Most adults don't understand that good food requires time and attention. Daddy says that anything worth doing is worth doing carefully, Sophie replied. He learned that from making jewelry, but it works for cooking too. Tom was setting the small dining table with mismatched plates that somehow created charm rather than evidence of financial limitation. The house might be modest, but it was filled with the kind of warmth that money couldn't purchase, evidence of love, creativity, and resilience in the face of difficult circumstances. Can I help with anything? Victoria asked. Actually, yes, Tom said. Sophie has been wanting to show you her artwork, but she's too polite to abandon cooking duties. Would you mind keeping an eye on the sauce while I get her portfolio? Victoria found herself alone in the kitchen with Sophie stirring pasta sauce and feeling more peaceful than she had in months. This was so different from the sterile perfection of her Beacon Hill townhouse, where everything was beautiful and nothing felt like home. Ms. Sterling, Sophie said while checking the pasta water, can I ask you something personal? Of course, sweetheart. Are you lonely? You seem like you might be lonely sometimes. The question hit Victoria with unexpected force. Sophie's emotional intelligence had identified something Victoria hadn't even admitted to herself, that 20 years of professional success had left her isolated in ways that wealth couldn't remedy. Sometimes I am, Victoria admitted. I work a lot, and I don't have family dinners like this very often. That's sad, Sophie said, with matter-of-fact compassion. Family dinners are the best part of most days. Even when I'm not feeling good, sitting around the table with people who care about you makes everything better. What makes a dinner feel like family? Victoria asked, genuinely curious about this child's understanding of connection. Talking about real things instead of just polite things, laughing at each other's jokes even when they're not very funny, helping each other with problems, celebrating good things together. Sophie tasted the sauce thoughtfully, and caring more about being together than about having perfect food or perfect conversations. Victoria felt something shift in her understanding of what she'd been missing. Her social interactions were largely professional or transactional, business dinners, charity galas, networking events where relationships serve strategic purposes rather than providing genuine connection. Sophie, Victoria said carefully, would you mind if I asked your advice about something? Sophie brightened with the pleasure of being consulted on adult matters. I'm a very good advice giver. Daddy says I get it from Mama. I'm trying to decide whether to start a new business with your father. It would mean leaving my old job and beginning something completely different. That's exciting, but also scary. Sophie considered this with the serious attention she brought to all important questions. Do you and Daddy both want to make beautiful things that help people? Yes, I think we do. Do you both care more about helping people than about making money? Victoria thought about Tom's willingness to sacrifice Sarah's ring for Sophie's medical care, about her own decision to resign from sterling luxury rather than continue profiting from theft. Yes, we do. Then you should definitely be partners, Sophie concluded with 8-year-old certainty. When people want the same good things and care about each other's happiness, working together makes both of them stronger. Tom returned with a portfolio of Sophie's artwork, just as Victoria was absorbing the wisdom of an 8-year-old's advice about business partnerships. What did you two decide while I was gone? Tom asked, noting the thoughtful expressions on both their faces. We decided that you and Miss Sterling should be partners, Sophie announced. And we decided that she should come to family dinners more often because being lonely is sad and we have extra love to share. Tom met Victoria's eyes across the kitchen, both of them recognizing the profound gift Sophie was offering, not just professional partnership, but inclusion in the family structure that had sustained him through every crisis. Sophie, Tom said gently, becoming partners with Ms. Sterling would be a very big decision that would affect our whole life. Are you sure you understand what that would mean? It would mean trusting each other to do the right thing even when it's difficult, Sophie said with remarkable insight. It would mean caring about each other's dreams and helping make them come true. And it would mean being brave enough to try something new because you believe in each other. Victoria felt tears threatening again at this child's unconscious description of what genuine partnership required: trust, mutual support, and shared courage in the face of uncertainty. That's exactly right, Victoria said softly. As they sat down to dinner, Victoria's phone buzzed with what felt like the 100th message from Sterling Luxury's legal team. David's emergency board meeting had apparently resulted in immediate action to challenge her resignation and force her return to corporate leadership. Victoria glanced at the message, then deliberately turned off her phone and set it aside. "Work emergency?" Tom asked, noting her expression. "Not anymore," Victoria replied. "I just realized that some things are more important than emergency board meetings." Sophie served the pasta with artistic flair, arranging each plate like a small masterpiece while explaining her cooking philosophy with the seriousness of a seasoned chef. "The most important ingredient is love," Sophie explained as she added final garnishes to their plates. "You can't taste it exactly, but you can feel it when someone cooks for you because they want you to be happy." Victoria took her first bite and understood immediately what Sophie meant. The food was delicious, but more importantly, it carried the unmistakable flavor of being made by someone who cared about her recipient's well-being. "This is wonderful, Sophie. Thank you for sharing your cooking talent with me." "Thank you for sharing your dinner with us," Sophie replied, with the gracious manners Tom had clearly worked to instill. "Family dinners are always better with more family." The simple statement carried weight that went far beyond politeness. Sophie wasn't just being welcoming, she was offering Victoria a place in their family structure, a role that went beyond business partnership to something more permanent and meaningful. "Sophie," Victoria said carefully, "I need to tell you both something important about my work situation." Tom set down his fork, recognizing the tone of someone about to deliver significant news. "This afternoon, I resigned from my position as CEO of Sterling Luxury," Victoria continued. "That means I no longer have the job that pays for big houses and expensive cars and medical equipment for families who need it." Sophie absorbed this information with thoughtful attention. "Why did you quit?" "Because I learned that my company was built on work stolen from your father. Because I couldn't keep accepting praise and money for achievements that weren't really mine. Because I decided that doing the right thing was more important than keeping a job that made me feel bad about myself." Sophie nodded solemnly, processing adult decisions through the moral framework Sarah had helped her develop. "Are you scared?" Sophie asked with typical directness. "Terrified," Victoria admitted. "I'm 41 years old and I just gave up the only career I've ever known. I have no idea what comes next." "But you're not alone," Sophie pointed out with 8-year-old logic. "You have us now, and Daddy's really good at starting over and building something beautiful from broken pieces." Tom felt his chest tighten with emotion at his daughter's unconscious wisdom. She'd identified the essential truth about their situation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together rather than alone. "Sophie's right," Tom said quietly. "Starting over is scary, but it's also an opportunity to build something better than what existed before." "And what kind of something?" Victoria asked. Tom thought about the question while Sophie continued eating with the satisfied attention of someone who'd successfully managed a complex social occasion. "A jewelry company that creates pieces telling real love stories instead of just expensive objects," Tom said slowly. "A business that honors relationships rather than just bank accounts. A partnership that proves you can build success without stealing from other people." "Mitchell Ramirez Designs," Victoria said softly, using her mother's name instead of the Sterling identity that had never truly belonged to her. "Mitchell Ramirez Designs." Tom repeated, testing the sound of equal partnership. "I like it." "Me too," Sophie added. "And I could be your official consultant since I'm the one who convinced you to work together." Victoria laughed, the first genuinely joyful sound she'd made in months. "That sounds like an excellent arrangement. What would your consulting fee be?" Sophie pretended to consider this seriously. "Maybe dinner once a week where we all cook together and plan beautiful things. And maybe sometimes you could help me with homework that involves art or math." "Deal," Victoria said immediately. "Though I should warn you that I might need help with the cooking part." "That's okay," Sophie replied with characteristic generosity. "Learning new things together is what families do." As they finished dinner and moved to the living room for Sophie's art portfolio presentation, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced since Isabella's death: genuine belonging. Not the performative belonging of corporate networking or charity board participation, but the deep security of being valued for who she actually was, rather than what she could provide. Sophie's artwork was remarkable, demonstrating technical skill far beyond her age while maintaining the emotional authenticity that formal training sometimes diminished. But what struck Victoria most was how many pieces incorporated themes of healing, transformation, and bringing broken things back together. This one, Sophie said, showing a drawing of a woman teaching a young girl to work with jewelry tools, is about how skills get passed down through families. Even when bad things happen, the good knowledge stays alive and gets shared with new people. Victoria studied the drawing, seeing in it possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. Not just business partnership with Tom, but mentorship with Sophie. Not just making amends for stolen designs, but creating a legacy that honored creativity, relationships, and the belief that broken things could become more beautiful than they'd ever been before. Sophie, Victoria said softly, would you like to learn real jewelry design techniques? Not just drawing, but working with actual metals and stones. Sophie's eyes went wide with excitement. Really, you would teach me? We would teach you, Victoria corrected, looking at Tom for confirmation. Your father knows techniques that I've never mastered, and I know business aspects that could help bring your artistic vision to market someday. Tom nodded, recognizing the gift Victoria was offering, not just partnership for himself, but creative mentorship for Sophie that could honor Sarah's artistic heritage while building toward a future neither of them had been able to imagine alone. I think, Tom said carefully, that sounds like the beginning of something extraordinary. As they planned their new venture, none of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, where David Sterling's private investigator was documenting Victoria's concerning associations for the corporate warfare that would begin in earnest tomorrow morning. But for tonight, in a modest house in Jamaica Plain, three people who had found each other through crisis were planning a future that honored truth over comfort, creativity over profit, and family over fear. The choice had been made. Now came the much harder work of building something beautiful enough to justify the price they'd paid for the chance to try. Victoria woke on Thursday morning to 17 missed calls, 43 unread text messages, and a process server standing on her front steps with documents that would reshape her understanding of how far David Sterling was willing to go to protect his empire. The legal paperwork was extensive and devastating: a temporary restraining order, preventing her from contacting any Sterling luxury employees, a corporate lawsuit claiming breach of fiduciary duty and theft of proprietary information, and most chilling of all, a petition for emergency guardianship that painted her resignation as evidence of mental instability requiring immediate intervention. Ms. Ramirez Sterling, the process server asked, using the hyphenated name that appeared on her birth certificate but hadn't been spoken aloud in 20 years. Yes, Victoria replied, accepting the papers with hands that trembled only slightly. You're being summoned to emergency court proceedings this afternoon at 2 p.m. Failure to appear will result in default judgment. As the process server departed, Victoria sat on her front steps reading legal documents designed to destroy not just her professional reputation, but her personal autonomy. David had weaponized the Massachusetts mental health system, using her resignation from Sterling Luxury as evidence of emotional breakdown requiring court intervention. The petition painted a picture of a woman who had exhibited increasingly erratic behavior, culminating in the abandonment of professional responsibilities and the formation of inappropriate personal relationships with individuals seeking to exploit her emotional vulnerability. David's lawyers had been thorough. They documented her medical assistance to Sophie Mitchell, her resignation from Sterling Luxury, her decision to associate with Tom Mitchell, despite his history of making false intellectual property claims against the company. The narrative they'd constructed made her choices appear delusional rather than ethical, mentally unstable rather than morally courageous. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Jonathan Mason, the employment attorney who'd helped her navigate corporate politics for the past 5 years. Victoria, what the hell is happening? Jonathan's voice carried the controlled panic of a lawyer whose client had just become the target of sophisticated legal warfare. David Sterling's office called me this morning, claiming you've had some kind of breakdown. I haven't had a breakdown, Jonathan. I've had a breakthrough. There's a difference. Victoria, they're seeking emergency guardianship. Do you understand what that means? If the court grants their petition, David gains legal control over your personal and financial decisions. He can institutionalize you, control your assets, make medical decisions on your behalf. The full scope of David's strategy became clear. He wasn't just trying to force her return to sterling luxury, he was attempting to remove her legal autonomy entirely, making her a ward of the court under his guardianship. They can't do that, Victoria said, though her voice carried less conviction than her words. They absolutely can if they convince the judge you're mentally incompetent, Jonathan replied grimly. And they have 20 years of documentation about your relationship with David, your financial dependence on sterling luxury, your sudden career abandonment. It's not impossible they could succeed. Victoria felt cold understanding settle over her. David's patient cultivation of her dependence, his careful documentation of every emotional instability, his positioning himself as the protective stepfather, it had all been preparation for this moment when her independence might threaten his interests. What do? We fight. But Victoria, you need to understand that winning this case might require exposing aspects of your relationship with David that you've never discussed publicly. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Before Victoria could answer, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Tom Mitchell. Jonathan, I have to take this. Tom, is everything okay? Victoria, we have a problem. Tom's voice carried the controlled urgency she was learning to associate with medical emergencies. Sophie's glucose monitors started malfunctioning this morning. The alerts are going off constantly, but her blood sugar levels are actually normal. What does Dr. Santos think? That's the thing, we can't reach Dr. Santos. Her office says she's been called away on family emergency and the replacement physician doesn't have access to Sophie's case history. They want us to bring Sophie in for a complete reevaluation of her monitoring system. Victoria felt ice in her stomach. Tom, this isn't coincidence. David Sterling has resources to investigate anyone connected to me. If he's discovered your connection to Sophie's medical care, you think he's sabotaging her monitoring system? I think he's eliminating any evidence of my charitable giving that might contradict his narrative about mental instability. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. David wasn't just attacking Victoria professionally, he was systematically dismantling every choice she'd made that demonstrated ethical reasoning rather than corporate loyalty. We're going to the hospital now, Tom said. But Victoria, if this man is willing to interfere with my daughter's medical care, I'm coming with you, Victoria interrupted. Whatever else happens, Sophie's safety comes first. Victoria, if you're dealing with legal problems, Sophie's safety comes first, Victoria repeated firmly. Everything else is secondary. At Boston Children's Hospital, the situation was even worse than Tom had described. Sophie's continuous glucose monitor wasn't just malfunctioning, it had been remotely deactivated. Its software corrupted in ways that suggested deliberate interference rather than technical failure. Dr. Santos's replacement, Dr. Richard Walsh, reviewed Sophie's case with the detached efficiency of someone managing crisis rather than providing ongoing care. The monitoring system appears to have experienced what the manufacturer calls catastrophic software failure, Dr. Walsh explained. All data has been corrupted and the device cannot be restored to function. What does that mean for Sophie's care? Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew. It means we need to return to traditional blood sugar monitoring while we arrange replacement equipment. However, I should mention that there seem to be some irregularities with the billing authorization for the original monitoring system. Victoria felt her chest tighten. What kind of irregularities? The medical equipment company received a call this morning from Sterling Luxury's legal department claiming that the payment authorization was made without proper corporate approval. They're demanding return of the monitoring device and threatening legal action if the equipment isn't surrendered immediately. The attack was even more sophisticated than Victoria had anticipated. David hadn't just corrupted Sophie's monitoring system, he'd created legal justification for removing it entirely, forcing the Mitchell family back into the medical vulnerability that had brought them together. Dr. Walsh, Victoria said carefully, I personally authorized that payment. There was no corporate approval required because it was my personal charitable giving. I understand that, Ms. Sterling, but the legal situation appears complex. Until ownership of the monitoring device is resolved, hospital policy requires that we cannot support its use for patient care. Sophie had been listening to this conversation from her hospital bed with the mature attention of a child accustomed to adult discussions about her medical needs affecting family decisions. Ms. Sterling, Sophie said quietly, is someone trying to take away my robot friend? Victoria met Sophie's eyes, seeing in them the trust that had sustained her through every difficult decision of the past week. This 8-year-old had offered her family membership, creative partnership, and moral guidance. Now that trust was being weaponized against them by a man who saw relationships as leverage rather than genuine connection. Yes, sweetheart, Victoria said honestly. Someone is trying to take away your monitoring system because they want to hurt me, and they think hurting you will make me change my mind about some business decisions. Sophie absorbed this with thoughtful attention, her young mind processing adult cruelty with the analytical skill that had helped her manage complex medical needs. That's not very nice, Sophie said finally. No, it's not nice at all. Are you going to let them take it away? Victoria looked at Tom, whose expression showed the same helpless anger she felt. David's legal maneuvering had created a situation where fighting for Sophie's medical equipment might result in prolonged legal battles that could disrupt her care even more severely. We're going to figure out a way to make sure you stay safe and healthy, Victoria said carefully. That might mean finding different equipment or different ways to monitor your diabetes, but we're not going to let anyone put your health at risk. What about the new business you and Daddy were going to start? Sophie asked with 8-year-old directness. It was the question Victoria had been avoiding since receiving David's legal papers. Mitchell Ramirez Designs couldn't exist if Victoria was declared mentally incompetent and placed under court guardianship. Their partnership would become impossible if she was institutionalized or had her assets frozen. That's complicated right now, Princess, Tom said gently. Sophie studied both adults with the perceptive intelligence that consistently surprised everyone around her. Are you giving up because things are hard? The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. Sophie wasn't just asking about business plans, she was asking whether the adults in her life would abandon their principles when faced with serious consequences. No, Victoria said firmly, we're not giving up, but we might need to find different ways to achieve what we want. Good, Sophie said with satisfaction. Mama used to say that the most important things are worth fighting for, even when fighting is scary. Jish Walsh cleared his throat diplomatically. I don't mean to interrupt, but we do need to make some immediate decisions about Sophie's monitoring situation. What are our options? Tom asked. Traditional fingerstick testing every 2 hours with manual insulin adjustments based on Sophie's responses. It's more labor-intensive and less predictive than continuous monitoring, but it's medically adequate for managing her condition. Tom nodded slowly, recognizing that they were being forced back to the exhausting routine they'd lived with for 3 years before Victoria's intervention. We'll do whatever keeps Sophie safe, Tom said. Actually, Victoria said suddenly, we have another option. Both Tom and Dr. Walsh looked at her questioningly. I'm going to purchase a replacement monitoring system directly through cash payment that doesn't involve Sterling luxury in any way. No corporate accounts, no business authorizations, no legal complications that can be challenged. Victoria, Tom said quietly, you just resigned from your job. Do you have that kind of money available? I have savings, Victoria replied, though she knew that liquid assets wouldn't last long if David succeeded in freezing her accounts. Sophie's health is worth any financial risk. Dr. Walsh looked uncertain. Ms. Sterling, given the legal complications you mentioned, I'm not sure the hospital can accept. Then we'll go to a different hospital, Victoria interrupted, or a private medical clinic, or directly to the manufacturer. Sophie will have continuous glucose monitoring regardless of what David Sterling thinks he can control. Sophie clapped her hands together with delight at Victoria's determined response. You really are going to fight for us. I really am, Victoria confirmed. Though I should probably warn you that fighting David Sterling is going to be more complicated than any of us expected. Over the next 6 hours, Victoria learned exactly how sophisticated David's attack had become. By 3 p.m., her personal bank accounts had been frozen pending the guardianship hearing. By 4 p.m., her credit cards had been suspended for suspicious activity. By 5 p.m., Sterling Luxury's security team had changed the locks on her company-provided vehicle and was demanding return of all corporate property. Tom drove Victoria to the emergency guardianship hearing, where David's legal team presented their case with devastating efficiency. They documented every erratic decision Victoria had made since Marcus Holloway's death, her obsession with Marcus's private files, her unauthorized charitable giving, her sudden resignation from a successful career, her formation of inappropriate personal relationships with people seeking to exploit her emotional vulnerability. The picture they painted was of a woman whose judgment had become increasingly compromised, whose decision-making capacity had deteriorated to the point where legal intervention was necessary to protect both her interests and the interests of those depending on Sterling Luxury's continued stability. Victoria's hastily assembled legal defense struggled against documentation that went back 20 years. David had been methodical in creating a paper trail that supported his narrative of protective stepfather concerned about an increasingly unstable daughter figure. Judge Margaret Thornton listened to both sides with the careful attention of someone making decisions that would fundamentally alter lives. At 62, she had the kind of measured judicial temperament that came from decades of seeing families destroy each other through legal warfare. Ms. Ramirez Sterling, Judge Thornton said finally, the court is concerned about the pattern of behavior described in these documents. Can you explain your recent decisions in a way that demonstrates continued capacity for sound judgment? Victoria stood to address the court, knowing that her words would determine not just her own future, but Tom and Sophie's ability to build the life they'd begun to envision together. Your Honor, 3 years ago, I discovered that the business I'd built my career on was founded on intellectual property theft. For 3 years, I tried to find ways to make amends that wouldn't destroy the livelihoods of innocent employees. When I met Thomas Mitchell and learned about his daughter's medical needs, I realized that my moral obligations were more important than my career security. And you believe that resigning from a successful position to associate with someone who'd made legal claims against your company demonstrates sound judgment. I believe that returning stolen property to its rightful owner and helping a sick child get medical care she needed demonstrates basic human decency, Victoria replied. If that's evidence of mental instability, then I question what kind of society we've become. Judge Thornton made notes with careful attention. Mr. Sterling, can you respond to Ms. Ramirez Sterling's characterization of these events? David stood with the authoritative bearing that had served him throughout his legal career. Your Honor, my stepdaughter has been manipulated by individuals seeking to exploit her charitable instincts and her guilt over circumstances beyond her control. The intellectual property claims she references were thoroughly investigated and dismissed for lack of evidence. Her current associations are with people who represent financial and emotional threats to her well-being. What kind of threats, Mr. Sterling? Thomas Mitchell has a history of making false claims against Sterling Luxury. His current medical and financial difficulties make him particularly motivated to exploit Victoria's emotional vulnerability. The child's medical condition, while genuine, is being weaponized to extract financial resources and business partnerships that Victoria would never consider under normal circumstances. The accusation hit Victoria like a slap. David was arguing that Tom was deliberately manipulating her through Sophie's medical needs, that her feelings for them were evidence of compromised judgment rather than genuine care. Your Honor, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger, I'd like the court to meet Sophie Mitchell before making any decisions about whether my concern for her represents compromised judgment or basic human compassion. Judge Thornton looked surprised. You're requesting that a minor be brought before this court. I'm requesting that you meet the child whose medical care is being characterized as emotional manipulation so you can judge for yourself whether she represents a threat to my mental stability or an opportunity for me to finally act according to my conscience. David's lawyers immediately objected, but Judge Thornton seemed intrigued by Victoria's request. Mr. Mitchell, are you willing to bring your daughter before this court? Tom had been sitting in the gallery watching Victoria defend not just her autonomy, but their entire future. Yes, Your Honor, Sophie understands that some adults are trying to make decisions about her medical care, and she has opinions about what's best for her own well-being. 30 minutes later, Sophie Mitchell entered the courtroom wearing her best dress and carrying the sketchbook that had become her constant companion. She walked directly to Judge Thornton's bench with the confident bearing of a child accustomed to advocating for her own medical needs. "Hello," Sophie said politely. "I'm Sophie Mitchell. I understand you're trying to decide whether Ms. Sterling is too sad or confused to make good decisions." Judge Thornton smiled despite the gravity of the proceedings. "That's right, Sophie. What do you think about that question? I think Ms. Sterling is sad because she found out that her company was built on work stolen from my daddy. I think she's confused because she wants to do the right thing, but the right thing is harder than the wrong thing. But I don't think that makes her crazy. I think that makes her a good person, trying to figure out how to be even better." "And what do you think about Ms. Sterling's decision to help with your medical care?" Sophie considered this with thoughtful attention. "I think she helped me because she understands what it feels like when people take things that belong to you. My health belongs to me, and the machine that keeps me safe belongs to me. But some mean people are trying to take it away to hurt Miss Sterling's feelings." David's face had gone very pale as Sophie's simple words dismantled his carefully constructed narrative about manipulation and exploitation. "Sophie," Judge Thornton continued gently, "do you think Ms. Sterling has been making good decisions or bad decisions?" "I think she's been making brave decisions," Sophie replied. "And brave decisions are almost always good decisions even when they make other people angry." Judge Thornton made more notes, then looked directly at David Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, after hearing from the child at the center of these allegations, do you still maintain that your stepdaughter's concern for her welfare represents evidence of mental incompetence?" David's silence stretched long enough to become damaging. Finally, he spoke with less conviction than his earlier arguments. "Your Honor, the child is obviously articulate, but children can be coached to say anything adults want them to say. Are you suggesting that an 8-year-old with type 1 diabetes has been coached to manipulate court proceedings?" Judge Thornton's tone carried sharp disapproval. "I'm suggesting that my stepdaughter's judgment has been compromised by people who understand how to exploit her emotional vulnerabilities." Sophie looked directly at David with the uncompromising directness that made adults uncomfortable. "Sir, I don't think you understand Miss Sterling very well. She's not vulnerable. She's strong enough to give up things that make her feel safe, so she can do things that make her feel proud." The courtroom was completely silent as an 8-year-old child delivered a more effective character witness than any legal testimony could have achieved. Judge Thornton reviewed her notes one final time, then delivered her ruling with the authority of someone whose decisions carried the weight of lives in the balance. The court finds insufficient evidence to support emergency guardianship. Ms. Ramirez Sterling's recent decisions, while unconventional, appear to be the result of ethical reflection rather than mental incapacity. The petition is denied. Victoria felt her knees weaken with relief, but Judge Thornton wasn't finished. However, the court is concerned about the broader family dynamics revealed in these proceedings. Sterling, your attempts to control your adult stepdaughter's personal and professional choices through legal manipulation represent a troubling pattern of behavior that this court cannot ignore. David's expression shifted from disappointment to alarm as he realized the judge's attention had turned toward his own conduct. The court is ordering a full investigation into Sterling Luxury's business practices, including the intellectual property claims referenced in today's testimony. If evidence of corporate misconduct is discovered, appropriate legal actions will be taken. As court adjourned, Victoria found herself surrounded by Tom, Sophie, and the overwhelming relief of people whose future had just been secured against forces that had seemed insurmountable. "We won," Sophie said with 8-year-old satisfaction. "We told the truth, and the truth was stronger than the mean person's lies." "We won this battle," Victoria corrected gently. "But David Sterling doesn't give up easily. This might just be the beginning of a longer war." "Then we'll fight the longer war together," Tom said firmly. "As partners." Victoria looked at this man and child who had transformed her understanding of family loyalty and courage. David's attack had been designed to isolate her, to force her to choose between security and conscience. Instead, it had revealed the strength that came from choosing authenticity over comfort, relationship over reputation. "Together," Victoria agreed. Outside the courthouse, Victoria found herself embraced by Tom and Sophie in a moment that felt like victory, despite the knowledge that David Sterling's war was far from over. But as they walked toward Tom's truck, none of them noticed the black sedan following at a careful distance, or the private investigator documenting their every move for David Sterling's next phase of attack. That evening, an unexpected alliance. Victoria sat in her Beacon Hill townhouse at 11 p.m., surrounded by legal documents and trying to process the day's emotional whiplash when her doorbell rang with the authoritative sound of someone who expected immediate attention. Through the peephole, she saw a woman she didn't recognize, elegantly dressed, perhaps 60, with silver hair, in the bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. But what caught Victoria's attention was the expression on the woman's face, determination mixed with something that looked like guilt. "Ms. Ramirez," the woman said when Victoria opened the door, "my name is Eleanor Sterling. I believe we need to talk." Victoria felt her stomach drop. Eleanor Sterling, David's ex-wife, a woman who had been notably absent from all Sterling family interactions for the past 15 years. "Mrs. Sterling," Victoria said carefully, "I'm not sure this is an appropriate time." "It's the perfect time," Eleanor interrupted with quiet authority, "because David has crossed lines tonight that even I can't ignore anymore." They settled in Victoria's living room, where Eleanor declined and offered refreshments and went directly to the purpose of her unexpected visit. "David called me 3 hours ago." Eleanor began, her voice carrying the careful control of someone managing rage. "He wanted me to testify at tomorrow's emergency board meeting about your alleged mental instability. He wanted me to provide documentation of family history that would support his guardianship petition." Victoria felt cold understanding settle over her. "And will you buy Ms. Ramirez, I divorced David Sterling 20 years ago because I discovered he was the kind of man who would destroy anyone who threatened his control, including his own family members." Eleanor's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. "Tonight he asked me to help him do to you what he did to me." "What did he do to you?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much of her personal history to reveal to a woman she'd never met, but whose situation reminded her painfully of her own past struggles. "He had me institutionalized for 6 months when I threatened to divorce him and take half his assets," Eleanor said finally. "Claimed I was having a nervous breakdown, that I was a danger to myself and others. By the time I was released and could fight the legal proceedings, he'd restructured all our financial holdings and positioned himself as the protective husband trying to save his unstable wife." Victoria stared at Eleanor in horror. "He's done this before." "David Sterling has spent 40 years perfecting the art of using the mental health system to control inconvenient women," Eleanor confirmed grimly. "What he's doing to you isn't personal, it's simply his standard operating procedure when legal intimidation fails." The revelation was devastating and illuminating simultaneously. David's attack on Victoria wasn't improvisation, it was a refined technique he'd used to destroy other women who'd threatened his authority. "Mrs. Sterling, why are you telling me this?" Eleanor's expression grew fierce with long-suppressed anger. "Because 20 years ago I didn't have the resources or support to fight him effectively. I lost half my life to his manipulation and control. You have something I didn't have: witnesses, documentation, and most importantly, people who care about you enough to fight beside you." "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we destroy David Sterling's ability to hurt any more women the way he hurt us." Eleanor opened her purse, revealing a thick folder of documents. "I've spent 20 years documenting his pattern of behavior, collecting evidence from other women he's targeted, building a case that could send him to federal prison for conspiracy and abuse of legal process." Victoria accepted the folder with trembling hands, scanning documents that revealed a pattern of sophisticated abuse spanning decades. David hadn't just targeted Victoria and Eleanor, he'd systematically destroyed at least 6 other women whose independence had threatened his interests. "My God," Victoria whispered, recognizing names of women whose nervous breakdowns and mental health episodes had been reported in Boston's social pages over the years. "How many lives has he destroyed?" "Too many," Eleanor replied grimly. "But with your case as the catalyst, we can finally stop him permanently." They spent the next 3 hours reviewing evidence that painted David Sterling as a serial predator who used legal and medical systems as weapons against women who challenged his authority. The documentation was extensive, damning, and assembled with the patience of someone who'd waited 20 years for the right moment to strike back. "Eleanor," Victoria said finally, "if we do this, if we expose his pattern of behavior, it won't just destroy him. It could bring down Sterling or luxury completely, cost hundreds of jobs, ruin the reputation I spent 20 years building. Sterling luxury was built on stolen artistic work and sustained through systematic abuse of women who threaten corporate interests, Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. Perhaps it deserves to be destroyed. Victoria thought about the employees whose livelihoods depended on Sterling luxury, about the charitable foundation that funded important community programs, about the complex economic ecosystem that surrounded the company's operations. What about the innocent people who'll be hurt if the company collapses? Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Victoria, I spent 20 years asking that same question, and it kept me silent while David continued destroying other women. Sometimes protecting innocent people from short-term consequences means allowing guilty people to cause long-term harm to even more innocent victims. The logic was undeniable, even if the emotional weight of it felt crushing. David Sterling's pattern of abuse would continue until someone had the courage to expose it completely, regardless of the collateral damage to his business empire. If we do this, Victoria said carefully, what happens to Tom and Sophie? David will escalate his attacks on them to hurt me. Actually, Eleanor said with grim satisfaction, that's the beauty of federal criminal prosecution. Once David is arrested for conspiracy and abuse of legal process, his ability to retaliate against anyone becomes severely limited. Federal judges don't tolerate witness intimidation. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Tom, whose voice carried the strain of someone dealing with escalating crisis. Victoria, we have another problem. Sophie's school received a call this afternoon from someone claiming to represent Child Protective Services. They're demanding a meeting tomorrow about Sophie's medical neglect and her exposure to unstable adult influences. Victoria felt rage unlike anything she'd ever experienced. David wasn't just attacking her. He was weaponizing the child welfare system against an 8-year-old girl whose only crime was accepting medical help from someone he wanted to control. Tom, that call didn't come from CPS. It came from David Sterling's people trying to terrify you into abandoning our partnership. How do you know? Victoria looked at Eleanor, who was nodding grimly. Because I'm sitting here with someone who can prove that David Sterling has a 40-year pattern of using government agencies to intimidate his targets. Eleanor leaned toward the phone. Mr. Mitchell, this is Eleanor Sterling, David's ex-wife. I want you to know that what he's doing to your family isn't personal. It's simply how he operates when people threaten his control. But I also want you to know that we're about to end his ability to hurt anyone ever again. Tom's voice was carefully controlled. What are you planning? We're planning to have David Sterling arrested by federal agents tomorrow morning on charges of conspiracy abuse, of legal process, and systematic violation of civil rights. Eleanor replied with satisfaction that had been building for 20 years. Will that protect Sophie? It will protect Sophie, Victoria, and every other woman David Sterling might target in the future, Eleanor confirmed. Though I should warn you that the next 48 hours are going to be extremely challenging for everyone involved. After Tom ended the call to explain the situation to Sophie, Victoria, and Eleanor continued planning their coordinated attack on David Sterling's carefully constructed system of control and intimidation. The FBI's Civil Rights Division has been investigating David for 6 months based on information that I've been providing, Eleanor explained. Your case was the final piece they needed to establish pattern and intent. The arrest warrant has already been signed. Victoria felt something between relief and terror. When will this happen? Tomorrow at 6 a.m., David Sterling will be arrested at his home on federal charges. By 9 a.m., news of his arrest will be public, and by noon, Sterling Luxury's board will be in emergency session to address the crisis. And what happens to me? Eleanor smiled with the first genuine warmth she had shown all evening. You get to start over with a clean slate, a cleared reputation, and the knowledge that you helped protect other women from experiencing what we both endured. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Victoria felt compelled to ask the question that had been nagging at her throughout their conversation. Eleanor, why did you wait 20 years to take action against David? Why now? Eleanor paused at the door, her expression showing decades of regret and frustration. Because 20 years ago, I was alone, terrified, and convinced that fighting him would only make things worse for everyone I cared about. Tonight I realized that staying silent hadn't protected anyone. It had simply given him 20 more years to perfect his techniques for destroying women. And what changed? I met an 8-year-old girl whose courage shamed me into remembering that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for ourselves, but for the people who come after us. Victoria felt tears threatening at the realization that Sophie's bravery had inspired not just her own transformation, but Eleanor's decision to finally confront the man who'd stolen 20 years of her life. Eleanor, Victoria said softly, thank you for finding the courage to fight when it mattered most. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to choose justice over fear, Eleanor replied. After Eleanor left, Victoria sat alone in her townhouse, processing the knowledge that within hours David Sterling's reign of terror would be ending, but not before one final escalation that would test everyone's resolve. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Ramirez, this is Dr. Santos. I need to speak with you urgently about Sophie Mitchell's medical situation. David Sterling has filed formal complaints with the Medical Licensing Board claiming I provided inappropriate care, influenced by financial incentives. Can we meet tomorrow at 7 a.m.? This situation has become very serious. Victoria realized that David's final attacks would target not just her and Tom, but everyone who had helped Sophie receive proper medical care. Dr. Santos, the hospital staff, even the medical equipment companies, anyone who had participated in saving Sophie's life, was now being threatened with professional and legal consequences. But tomorrow, Eleanor Sterling's 20 years of patient planning would collide with David Sterling's 40 years of systematic abuse, and only one of them would survive the encounter. Victoria fell asleep that night with her phone beside her, waiting for Eleanor's call that would signal the beginning of the end of David Sterling's ability to hurt anyone ever again. The battle was about to become a war, but for the first time since it began, Victoria felt like she might actually win. 6 a.m. The next morning, Victoria's phone rang at exactly 6:02 a.m. with Eleanor's call. It's done. David Sterling is in federal custody. The nightmare is over. But as Victoria would soon discover, David Sterling had prepared one final attack that would unfold even as he sat in a federal holding cell, and the next 12 hours would test every bond they'd built through crisis and choice. The war was ending, but victory would require one last act of courage from an 8-year-old girl whose wisdom had started everything. The news broke on Friday morning with the kind of explosive coverage that transforms private struggles into public battlegrounds. Victoria woke to her doorbell ringing at 6 a.m., followed by the discovery of 3 news vans parked outside her Beacon Hill townhouse and reporters shouting questions about the Sterling luxury scandal and corporate theft allegations. Her phone had been buzzing with calls since 5 a.m. Journalist industry contacts former Sterling luxury employees seeking comment on stories that painted her either as a whistleblowing hero or a mentally unstable executive whose accusations threatened hundreds of jobs. The headline in the Boston Globe read, Sterling luxury CEO resigns amid intellectual property theft allegations. Former business partner claims designs were stolen decade ago. The article was surprisingly thorough, including quotes from industry experts who had wondered about the sudden appearance of innovative design techniques in Marcus Holloway's work. Former Sterling luxury employees who described a corporate culture built on secrecy and intimidation, and most damaging of all, legal experts who explained how sophisticated corporate theft could be concealed through patent manipulation and legal technicalities. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Tom, whose voice carried a mixture of concern and amazement. Victoria, have you seen the news coverage? Hard to miss it when there are reporters camping on my front lawn, Victoria replied, watching through her windows as more media vehicles arrived. How are you and Sophie handling this? That's why I'm calling. Sophie has some thoughts about the news coverage that I think you should hear. Victoria could hear Sophie's voice in the background, clearly eager to share her perspective on their situation, becoming public knowledge. Put her on speaker, Victoria said, needing the wisdom of an 8-year-old more than any corporate crisis management consultant. Ms. Victoria, Sophie's voice carried excitement, rather than the distress Victoria had feared. Did you see that the newspaper people are finally telling everyone that Daddy created those beautiful designs? Victoria felt her chest tighten with emotion. While she'd been focused on the invasion of privacy and potential damage to their reputations, Sophie had seen the coverage as vindication for her father's stolen work. Yes, sweetheart, I saw that. How do you feel about people knowing our story? I feel happy that people finally know the truth about Daddy's work. And I feel proud that you were brave enough to tell everyone, even when telling the truth was scary. Tom's voice came back on the line. Victoria, there's something else you should know. We've been getting calls all morning from jewelry industry people, from potential clients, from other designers who want to work with Mitchell Ramirez Designs. What kind of calls? The kind that suggest we might have more business opportunities than we can handle, Tom said with wonder in his voice. Apparently your willingness to acknowledge the truth about Marcus's theft has given you more credibility in the industry than Sterling Luxury's reputation ever provided. Victoria moved away from the window, processing this unexpected development. She'd expected the scandal to destroy her professional standing. Instead, it seemed to be establishing a different kind of reputation, one built on integrity rather than corporate success. Sophie wants to ask you something, Tom continued. What is it, sweetheart? Ms. Victoria, do you think we could use some of the newspaper attention to help other people? Like maybe people would listen to us about important thing now that they're paying attention to our story. Victoria smiled at Sophie's instinctive understanding of opportunity within crisis. What kind of important things? Like how kids with diabetes need better medical equipment, and how artists should get credit for their work, and how families shouldn't have to choose between medical care and keeping their houses. The sophistication of Sophie's thinking continued to amaze Victoria. This child was suggesting they leverage their newfound public platform to advocate for systemic changes that went far beyond their personal situation. That's a brilliant idea, Sophie. We absolutely should use this attention to help other people. Good, I already started writing a list of things we could tell people about. Want to hear it? Before Victoria could respond, her doorbell rang with the authoritative sound of someone who expected immediate attention rather than requesting it. Hold on, Sophie. Someone's at my door. Victoria looked through the peephole to see Jonathan Mason, her attorney, standing beside a woman she didn't recognize, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase with the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering important news. Tom, my lawyer's here with someone. Can I call you back in a few minutes? Of course, but Victoria, whatever happens next, remember that you're not facing it alone anymore. Victoria opened the door to admit Jonathan and his companion, who introduced herself as Margaret Chen, the same Margaret Chen from Meridian Fine Jewelry, but now wearing a very different expression. Ms. Ramirez, Margaret said, using Victoria's mother's name with careful respect. I have some information that might be relevant to your current situation. They settled in Victoria's living room, where the elegant furnishings suddenly felt like stage props from a life that no longer fit her actual identity. After your visit to Meridian yesterday, Margaret began, I did some research into the ring Mr. Mitchell brought for appraisal. The craftsmanship was so distinctive that I wanted to understand its provenance more thoroughly. Jonathan looked confused. Margaret, I'm not sure how jewelry appraisal relates to Victoria's current legal situation. It relates because the techniques used in that ring match design elements I've been seeing in Sterling Luxury pieces for years, Margaret continued, elements that Marcus Holloway claimed as his innovations. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. You found evidence of the theft. I found something better. I found proof that Thomas Mitchell's work predates Marcus Holloway's claimed innovations by at least 3 years. Margaret opened her briefcase, revealing documentation that looked like historical treasure. I've been documenting innovative jewelry techniques for the Smithsonian's American Craft Museum for the past 15 years. Mr. Mitchell's work appears in my archives from 2011 onwards, years before Sterling Luxury's Eternal Bonds collection launched. Jonathan leaned forward with the intensity of a lawyer recognizing game-changing evidence. You're saying you have independent documentation proving Tom's authorship? I'm saying I have museum-quality documentation that establishes Thomas Mitchell as one of the most innovative jewelry designers of his generation, Margaret replied. Work that was stolen, marketed, and profited from without his knowledge or consent. Victoria felt tears of relief and vindication threatening. Margaret, why are you sharing this with us? Because, Margaret said quietly, my parents were immigrants who had their restaurant concept stolen by a corporate chain that turned their family recipes into franchise profits. I understand what it means when powerful people take credit for others' creativity. The room was quiet as the implications settled over them. Margaret's documentation didn't just prove Marcus's theft, it established Tom as a significant artist whose work deserved recognition independent of the scandal surrounding its appropriation. There's more, Margaret continued. The Smithsonian is interested in acquiring several of Mr. Mitchell's pieces for their permanent collection. They want to mount an exhibition about innovation in American jewelry design with his work as the centerpiece. Victoria laughed with shock and joy. Tom is going to be featured in a Smithsonian exhibition, if he's willing. And if you're both interested, the museum would also like to commission new collaborative pieces that demonstrate how traditional techniques can be combined with contemporary innovation. It was vindication beyond anything Victoria had dared to hope for, not just acknowledgement of past theft, but recognition of ongoing artistic significance that could establish Mitchell Ramirez Designs as a creative force rather than simply a business venture. Jonathan was making rapid notes with the enthusiasm of a lawyer whose client had just been handed overwhelming evidence in their favor. Margaret, would you be willing to testify about these findings if David Sterling challenges the intellectual property claims? Absolutely. In fact, I've already contacted the FBI's art crime team about potential federal charges related to intellectual property theft and fraud in the luxury goods market. Victoria stared at Margaret in amazement. The FBI, when theft involves interstate commerce and fraudulent marketing of artistic work, it becomes a federal crime, Margaret explained. Marcus Holloway's actions weren't just civil violations, they were criminal fraud on a scale that affected international markets. Before anyone could respond, Victoria's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Victoria Ramirez, this is Sarah Chen from the Boston Globe. I'm working on a follow-up story about the Sterling luxury allegations, and I've received some very interesting documents from someone claiming to represent David Sterling's legal interest. Victoria felt ice settle in her stomach. What kind of documents? Medical records suggesting you've been under psychiatric care, financial records indicating significant debt problems, personal information about your relationship with Thomas Mitchell that paints it as potentially exploitative. I'm calling to give you a chance to respond before publication. David's counterattack was predictably vicious. He was attempting to destroy Victoria's credibility by weaponizing her mental health history and financial information against her. It was character assassination disguised as investigative journalism. Ms. Chen, those records were obtained illegally and contain private medical information that has no bearing on the intellectual property theft allegations, Victoria said carefully. So you're not denying their accuracy. I'm not confirming or denying the contents of stolen medical records. But I will say this, if David Sterling is willing to violate federal privacy laws to silence someone exposing corporate theft, that probably tells you everything you need to know about his character. Victoria ended the call feeling the weight of what was coming. David wasn't just fighting to protect Sterling luxury, he was waging total war against anyone who threatened his control. Jonathan, Victoria said quietly, we need to be prepared for David to get much uglier before this is over. Actually, Jonathan replied with grim satisfaction, I think David Sterling just made a critical mistake. Illegally obtaining medical records to intimidate a whistleblower is a federal crime that carries serious penalties. He's transformed this from a family dispute into criminal behavior. Margaret nodded approvingly. The FBI takes privacy violations very seriously, especially when they're used to silence people exposing corporate fraud. Victoria felt something shift in her understanding of their situation. For the first time since this battle began, David had overplayed his hand in a way that provided them with concrete legal advantages. Her phone rang again, this time with Tom's number. Victoria, you need to get over here immediately, Tom said, his voice carrying excitement rather than alarm. Sophie has something to show you that's going to change everything. At Tom's house, 1 hour later, Victoria arrived at the modest house in Jamaica Plain to find the front yard filled with news vans, neighbors gathered in supportive clusters, and Sophie holding court from the front porch like an 8-year-old press conference coordinator. Ms. Victoria, Sophie waved enthusiastically as Victoria approached through the crowd of reporters. Come see what I made. Sophie had created what could only be described as a multimedia presentation spread across the front porch. Her artwork displayed alongside printed articles about intellectual property, theft, photographs of jewelry designs, and handwritten signs that read, "Art belongs to artists," and "Stolen dreams should be returned." Sophie, this is amazing, Victoria said, genuinely awed by the child's instinctive understanding of public advocacy. How did you organize all this? Daddy helped with the computer research, but I did the organizing. I wanted people to understand that this isn't just about our family. It's about all the artists whose work gets stolen by mean companies. Tom emerged from the house carrying more display materials, his expression showing pride mixed with amazement at his daughter's initiative. She's been working on this since 6 a.m., Tom explained. Apparently, Sophie has very strong opinions about intellectual property rights and artistic attribution. I learned about it in social studies, Sophie said matter-of-factly. Mrs. Peterson taught us about how Native Americans had their land and culture stolen and how African Americans had their music and inventions stolen. I realized that what happened to Daddy is part of a really big problem that hurts lots of people. Victoria felt her chest tighten with pride and amazement. Sophie had connected their personal struggle to broader questions of justice and systemic exploitation, transforming their story from individual grievance into social advocacy. Sophie, Victoria said carefully, do you understand that talking to reporters means lots of people will know about your diabetes and our family situation? I understand that talking to reporters means lots of people will learn that artists deserve credit for their work and kids with diabetes deserve medical care they can afford. Sophie replied with 8-year-old clarity about her priorities. A reporter from Channel 5 approached with her cameraman clearly drawn by Sophie's articulate presentation of complex issues. Excuse me, Sophie, I'm Lisa Martinez from Channel 5 News. Would you be willing to talk about your artwork and your family's situation? Sophie looked at Tom and Victoria for permission, then faced the camera with the composed confidence of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire 8 years of life. Hi, I'm Sophie Mitchell. My daddy is Thomas Mitchell, who creates beautiful jewelry that helps people remember love. 10 years ago, a mean man named Marcus Holloway stole all of Daddy's designs and used them to make himself rich and famous. The reporter listened with growing amazement as Sophie continued with perfect clarity and age-appropriate language. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is that Ms. Victoria found out about the stealing, and even though telling the truth made her life really hard, she decided to help us anyway. Now we're going to be partners and create beautiful things together, and we're going to make sure other artists never get their work stolen. Sophie, what would you say to other children whose families are dealing with medical expenses they can't afford? Sophie considered this thoughtfully. I would say that there are grown-ups who care about kids more than they care about money, and if you keep being brave and telling the truth about what you need, those grown-ups will find you. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she watched this remarkable child transform their story from scandal into inspiration, from victimhood into advocacy. And what would you say to Miss Victoria, who gave up her job to help your family? Sophie turned to look directly at Victoria with the kind of unguarded love that made everything else secondary. I would say thank you for showing me that the best grown-ups are the ones who care more about being good than about being comfortable. And I would say that even though your old job is gone, you found something better. You found us. The interview continued for 20 minutes with Sophie fielding questions about diabetes awareness, artistic rights, and family resilience with wisdom that left professional reporters speechless. But it was her closing statement that captured national attention and transformed their local story into a movement. Sometimes bad things happen that seem really unfair. But if you have people who love you and if you keep trying to do the right thing even when it's hard, those bad things can turn into good things that help lots of other people too. My daddy's stolen designs are finally going to have his name on them. My diabetes has the best monitoring equipment in the world. And Ms. Victoria learned that being honest feels better than being rich. Sophie paused, looking directly into the camera with the solemn attention of someone delivering a message she considered critically important. The most important thing is that we found each other. And now we're a family that makes beautiful things and helps other families when they need it. That's worth more than all the money in the world. As the interview concluded and reporters began dispersing to file their stories, Victoria found herself sitting on Tom's front porch swing beside Sophie, watching the media circus with a sense of surreal peace. Sophie, Victoria said quietly, do you realize what you just did? I told everyone our story so they could understand why truth is more important than comfort. Sophie replied matter-of-factly, you did more than that. You turned our pain into purpose. You made our struggle mean something bigger than just our family. Tom joined them on the porch swing, the three of them fitting together with the natural ease of people who'd chosen to become family, despite circumstances that could have driven them apart. So, Tom said, I guess we're really doing this. Mitchell Ramirez Designs is officially launched whether we're ready or not. Are you ready? Victoria asked, suddenly aware of how much their lives were about to change. I'm scared, excited, overwhelmed, and grateful all at the same time, Tom replied honestly. But yes, I'm ready to build something beautiful with you. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Jonathan Mason. Victoria, you need to know that David Sterling just made another critical error. His team leaked those medical records to several news outlets, and it's being treated as a major privacy violation story. The FBI has opened a formal investigation into his conduct. What does that mean? It means that within 48 hours, David Sterling went from being a respected corporate attorney to being the subject of federal criminal investigation. The story has shifted from questioning your judgment to exposing his criminal behavior. Victoria felt something like justice beginning to take shape. David's attempts to destroy her had backfired so spectacularly that he'd become the villain of his own story. There's more, Jonathan continued. I've been contacted by 3 major jewelry companies who want to discuss partnership opportunities with Mitchell Ramirez Designs. Apparently, Sophie's interview this afternoon has generated significant industry interest in your collaborative work. Victoria looked at Sophie, who was sketching contentedly in her notebook while listening to adult conversations with the selective attention of someone who understood which information was important and which was simply grown-up noise. Jonathan, can you handle the business inquiries for now? I have more important things to focus on today. Of course, but Victoria, you should know that you're about to be offered opportunities that could make Mitchell Ramirez Designs one of the most successful jewelry companies in New England within 5 years. That's wonderful, Victoria replied. But right now, I'm more interested in making dinner with my family and planning our first official design collaboration. After ending the call, Victoria turned to Tom and Sophie with a question that felt like the beginning of everything they'd been working toward. So, she said, what should our first Mitchell Ramirez Designs piece be? Sophie immediately brightened with creative excitement. Something that tells the story of families choosing each other, like maybe a pendant that starts as separate pieces and becomes more beautiful when they're connected. Tom nodded thoughtfully. Modular design that celebrates unity without losing individual identity. I like it. And, Sophie added with the business instincts that consistently surprised adults, we could make it affordable enough that regular families could buy it, not just rich people. Victoria felt her heart swell with pride at this child's unconscious understanding of their values-based approach to business. Sophie, that's perfect. We create beautiful things that regular families can afford, that tell real love stories instead of just expensive ones. As the sun set over Jamaica Plain, 3 people who'd found each other through crisis began sketching their first collaborative design, a pendant system that would allow families to add elements as they grew, creating jewelry that became more meaningful over time rather than simply more expensive. It was exactly the kind of innovation that Thomas Mitchell had dreamed of creating 10 years ago, exactly the kind of meaningful work that Victoria had never been able to pursue while building her corporate empire, exactly the kind of beauty that Sophie intuitively understood art was supposed to create. 6 months later, the workshop space in Cambridge's Porter Square buzzed with creative energy that would have made Isabella Ramirez proud. Sunlight streamed through tall windows onto workbenches where Tom and Victoria bent over design sketches, their collaborative process having evolved into something that honored both their individual strengths and their shared vision. Mitchell Ramirez Designs read the simple sign on the front door, though most of their clients knew the company by reputation rather than storefront visibility. Word had spread organically through Boston's artistic community about the innovative partnership creating custom pieces that captured love stories in precious metals and evolving designs. Sophie's diabetes was perfectly managed through the monitoring system that had sparked their initial connection, but more importantly, she'd become the company's unofficial creative director and community outreach coordinator. Her understanding of what made jewelry emotionally meaningful had shaped their entire design philosophy. The Morrison anniversary set is ready for final approval. Tom announced, holding up matching rings that incorporated elements from both the couple's original wedding bands and their children's birthstones. 25 years of marriage blended family, and they wanted jewelry that would honor both their history and their future. Victoria looked up from her sketches of the pediatric diabetes awareness bracelet line they were launching in partnership with Boston Children's Hospital. They're beautiful, Tom. The way you incorporated the vintage elements with Sophie's suggested modifications is perfect. Team effort, Tom replied, settling beside her to examine the bracelet prototypes. Sophie's insight about children needing jewelry that makes them feel proud of their medical conditions rather than ashamed of them was brilliant. The transition from corporate scandal to creative partnership had exceeded everyone's expectations. David Sterling's criminal prosecution for privacy violations had resulted in his disbarment and Sterling Luxury's dissolution, with company assets being liquidated to pay settlements to artists whose work had been appropriated over the years. But more importantly, the public attention surrounding their story had created opportunities none of them had anticipated. The Smithsonian exhibition featuring Tom's work had established him as a significant American craft artist. Sophie's advocacy for pediatric diabetes awareness had resulted in speaking opportunities and consulting roles that made her one of the youngest healthcare activists in New England. Victoria's transformation from corporate executive to values-driven entrepreneur had made her a sought-after speaker about ethical business practices. Ms. Victoria, Mr. Tom, Sophie's voice preceded her arrival in the workshop school backpack, sliding off her shoulder as she settled into what had become her designated consultation space. I have news about the family jewelry project. Good news or complicated news? Victoria asked, having learned to distinguish between Sophie's different types of announcements. Really, really good news. Emma's mom showed our modular family pendant designed to her book club, and now 12 families want to commission sets. Plus, Mrs. Patterson wants to write an article about us for Boston Magazine. Tom raised an eyebrow. 12 families, that's substantial. What's our timeline? Well, Sophie settled into her consultation mode. They want to surprise their kids with the family pendants at the Spring School Art Show. So we have 6 weeks, which should be perfect if we bring in Lisa and Michael to help with the metalwork. Lisa Chen and Michael Rodriguez had been their first employees, recent jewelry design graduates, whose innovative techniques complemented the traditional craftsmanship that defined Mitchell Ramirez designs. Hiring them had felt like a declaration that their company was committed to nurturing emerging talent rather than just creating expensive objects. I'll call Lisa and Michael, Victoria said. And Sophie, excellent work identifying this opportunity. Your consultation fee this week is definitely the deluxe dinner with the dessert you've been requesting. Sophie beamed with satisfaction. Can we try making that lemon cake Mama used to love? I found her recipe in the kitchen drawer. Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Sophie mentioned Sarah. 6 months of family dinners had taught her that grief could coexist with joy, that honoring the past didn't require abandoning the future. I would love to try making Sarah's lemon cake, Victoria said softly. It sounds like a perfect way to celebrate our success. As if summoned by mention of celebration, Victoria's phone buzzed with a call from Jonathan Mason. Victoria, I have news about the federal investigation into Sterling Luxury's business practices, Jonathan said, his voice carrying satisfaction that suggested good developments. What kind of news? The kind that results in substantial settlements for wronged artists and regulatory changes to prevent intellectual property theft in the luxury goods industry. The Department of Justice is using your case as the foundation for new enforcement policies. Victoria felt pride mixed with relief. Their personal struggle was creating systemic changes that would protect other artists from experiencing the theft that had nearly destroyed Tom's career. There's more, Jonathan continued. The Smithsonian wants to expand the exhibition of Tom's work into a traveling show that would visit major cities nationwide. They're calling it Stolen Dreams, Reclaimed Art, the fight for creative justice. Victoria looked at Tom, who was listening to her side of the conversation with growing amazement. Jonathan, that's incredible. But you know, Tom will want to include other artists whose work has been stolen, not just focus on his own experience. Actually, that's exactly what the Smithsonian is planning. Tom's story opened doors for investigating intellectual property theft throughout the art world. The exhibition will feature dozens of artists whose work was appropriated without credit or compensation. Tom's expression showed the kind of emotional overwhelm that came from receiving recognition that exceeded your wildest dreams. Tell them yes, Tom said quietly. If our story can help other artists get justice, then everything we've been through was worth it. As Victoria concluded the call, Sophie looked up from her sketching with a perceptive attention that made adult conversations both more meaningful and more honest. Are you crying because you're happy or because you're Aisha? Sophie asked Victoria with 8-year-old directness. Happy, Victoria said, wiping tears she hadn't realized were falling. I'm crying because sometimes when really good things happen, your heart gets so full of gratitude that it overflows through your eyes. Sophie nodded solemnly. Mama used to cry like that when good things happened. She said it was her heart's way of saying thank you to the universe for surprises that were better than anything she could have planned. Victoria felt the familiar amazement at this child's wisdom, her ability to transform adult complexity into truths that illuminated rather than confused. Your mama was very wise, Victoria said softly. She was. And she would have loved you and our family business and the way we help other families create beautiful things together. Tom watched this exchange with the deep contentment that had replaced the constant anxiety that had defined his life for 10 years. Sophie's medical needs were completely managed, their financial security was established through meaningful work, and most importantly, they'd built something together that honored love rather than simply generating profit. You know what I think, Tom said, settling beside them in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through their workshop windows. What? Sophie asked, always eager for her father's observations about their evolving family dynamic. I think that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually the universe's way of preparing us for the best things we never knew were possible. Victoria nodded, thinking about the journey from Marcus's betrayal to this moment of creative partnership and chosen family. 10 years ago, I thought losing my career was the end of my story, Tom continued. But it was actually the beginning of a better story that I couldn't have written alone. And I thought that building a successful company on stolen foundations was an achievement, Victoria added. But the real achievement was learning to build something honest with people who matter more than profit margins. Sophie clapped her hands together with delight at their philosophical insights. And I learned that even scary things like diabetes can bring good people into your life if you're brave enough to let them help you. As they prepared to close the workshop for the day and head home for another family dinner, Victoria felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that served love rather than simply generating wealth. Their first year had exceeded every expectation financially, creatively, and most importantly, personally. Mitchell Ramirez Designs was profitable, respected, and growing rapidly through word-of-mouth recommendations from clients who appreciated jewelry that told their actual stories rather than simply displaying their economic status. But the real victory wasn't professional success, it was the transformation of three people who'd found each other through crisis into a family that created beauty, served justice, and proved that love really could triumph over power when people were brave enough to choose authenticity over comfort. Ready to go home? Tom asked as they gathered their tools and sketches. We are home, Sophie said matter-of-factly. Wherever we're together, that's home. Victoria smiled at this child's unconscious poetry, her ability to distill profound truths into simple statements that captured everything that mattered. You're absolutely right, Victoria said. We are home. As they walked through Cambridge's evening streets toward the family dinner that had become the cornerstone of their daily routine, none of them could have imagined that their story of transformation would inspire thousands of other families to choose courage over comfort, truth over security, love over fear. The ending Victoria had feared most, losing everything she'd built, had actually been the beginning she'd been searching for her entire life. Sometimes the greatest victories really were disguised as devastating defeats. Sometimes losing everything that felt safe was exactly what you needed to find everything that actually mattered. And sometimes an 8-year-old girl's wisdom was the compass that guided adults home to the people they were always meant to become. Epilogue. 1 year later, the spring exhibition opening at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston drew crowds that spilled out onto Huntington Avenue. Artists, activists, families, and industry leaders gathering to celebrate. Stolen Dreams Reclaimed Art, the traveling exhibition that had become a national conversation about creative justice and intellectual property rights. Sophie Mitchell Ramirez stood before her own contribution to the exhibition, a series of pendant designs that told the story of families choosing each other across difference and difficulty. At 9 years old, she was the youngest artist featured in the show, her work selected not for sentimental reasons, but for genuine innovation that captured the exhibition's themes of loss recovery and transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, the museum director announced to the gathered crowd, "I'd like to introduce the Mitchell Ramirez family whose personal journey exposed systemic problems in our industry and inspired the advocacy work that made this exhibition possible." Tom, Victoria, and Sophie stepped forward, together a family unit that had been forged through crisis and strengthened through choosing each other again and again through every subsequent challenge. 2 years ago, Victoria said to the crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the packed gallery, "I was a corporate executive who had unknowingly built her career on stolen foundations. Today, I'm an artist advocate and family member who has learned that the most beautiful things in life are created through honesty, courage, and love." Tom nodded, adding, 10 years ago, I lost my professional identity when my designs were stolen. Today, I understand that what was taken from me individually was returned to me as part of something larger, a family, a mission, and a community of people committed to protecting creative integrity." Sophie stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd spent 2 years advocating for causes she cared about. "And I learned how," Sophie said, her clear voice reaching every corner of the gallery, "that the best families are the ones people choose to build together. The best art is made by people who care about each other, and the best grown-ups are the ones who keep trying to make the world more beautiful for children." The applause was sustained and heartfelt, but what mattered most to the three of them was the knowledge that their story, their collision reckoning, choice battle, and victory had created ripples of positive change that extended far beyond their own healing. Mitchell Ramirez Designs had become more than a successful jewelry company. It was proof that businesses could serve justice, that families could be chosen across any difference, and that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the first step toward the best life you never knew was possible. As they walked through the exhibition together, admiring work by dozens of artists whose stolen dreams had finally been reclaimed, Victoria felt the deep peace that came from knowing she was exactly who and where she was meant to be. The little girl who had lost her mother too young had become a woman who helped other families heal. The man who had lost his career to betrayal had become an artist whose work would inspire generations. The child who faced medical challenges with extraordinary courage had become an advocate whose voice changed laws and hearts. They had all learned the same truth. Love really does win, but first it requires you to be brave enough to lose everything that was never truly yours in order to find everything that always had been. Sometimes the collision you think will destroy you is actually the moment your real life begins. Sometimes the ending you fear most is actually the beginning you've been searching for all along. And sometimes the family you choose becomes more beautiful than any family you could have been born into. Victoria, Isabella Ramirez, Tom Mitchell, and Sophie Mitchell Ramirez had become living proof that redemption isn't just possible. It's the point of every story brave enough to choose love over fear, truth over comfort, and each other over everything else. Their victory wasn't measured in dollars or recognition, though those had come abundantly. Their victory was measured in morning conversations over breakfast, in collaborative creativity that honored all their talents, in the security of knowing they belonged to each other regardless of what challenges the future might bring. They had built an empire that would last forever, not because it was made of precious metals and stones, but because it was made of love, truth, and the unshakable foundation of people who had chosen to trust each other with their whole hearts. That was the kind of wealth that could never be stolen. That was the kind of success that transformed not just individuals, but entire communities. That was the kind of victory that proved once and for all that sometimes the best things in life really do come to those who are brave enough to lose everything false in order to find everything true. The end. When you choose love over fear, truth over comfort, and each other over everything else, you don't just change your own story, you change the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey of transformation, redemption, and the power of chosen family. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others who might need to remember that love really does win, and that sometimes the most beautiful endings are disguised as devastating beginnings.